Committee will come to order. I ask unanimous consent the chair be authorized to declare recesses during today's hearing without objection. So ordered. Before we begin today, I do want to take a few moments to update the audience and anyone listening to the important work this committee is undertaking in response to the devastating Lion Air 610 and Ethiopian Airlines 302 accidents and subsequent international grounding of the Boeing 737 MAX. Following the Federal Aviation's grounding, Subcommittee Rick Larson and I launched an investigation into the FAA's certification of the MAX, which will include a rigorous evaluation of the roles and responsibilities of both FAA and Boeing during the MAX certification, how safety-critical systems that did not exist on prior 737 models were tested, evaluated, and assumed to be safe, and why the MAX was certified without requiring additional pilot training, among other things. In addition to starting our initial investigatory work last week, we also requested the Department of Transportation Inspector General perform its own investigation into the MAX's certification, which we have asked to include a comprehensive look at the FAA's evaluation of new features, including sensors and software, pilot training and manuals, and how new features were communicated to airlines, pilots, foreign authorities. We've also requested the Inspector General provide us with a status report on any corrective actions undertaken by the FAA since the first accident and whether pilot training is adequate before the MAX returns to revenue service. Further, the committee now has a whistleblower webpage to serve as a resource for anyone who has information to share so they can do so anonymously as we continue our investigation. And we're eager to hear from anyone who can help. I extend an invitation to any current, former FAA Boeing employee who have concerns. Please feel safe and come forward. And today, we're sending a bipartisan letter to the FAA urging the agency to engage in independent third-party review of Boeing's proposed changes to the 737 MAX and to evaluate that the manufacturer's fix is comprehensive, pilots have the information and training they need to fly the aircraft safely. This must all be done before the 737 MAX is certified to return to service. The traveling public needs assurances that the FAA will only recertify the aircraft for flight if and when the FAA outside safety and technical experts and pilots agree the aircraft is safe to fly. Later this week, I will submit document requests to the FAA and Boeing to drill down into key certification decisions regarding the MAX. We plan to dig deep into the issues surrounding the recent accidents over the coming weeks and months. Tragedies like these should not happen. The Transportation Infrastructure Committee is committed to ensuring the safety of our transportation system, and under my chairmanship, we will take all steps necessary to do so. I expect that our work will shed light on any deficiencies in the certification of aircraft in the United States, and we will ensure all lessons are applied and effect changes to improve the safety of our air transportation system and hopefully other nations as well. And in the not too distant future, we will, once we have documents and information we need, we will be holding a hearing on these issues. But today, it's a different topic, and it's an important topic as well. Not as life and death as the first, but incredibly important to the future of aviation, commercial aviation in this country. Back in February, we held the first hearing on why our infrastructure investments can't wait, and today we will drill down more into the ever-growing capital needs of airports, potential solutions to bridge the funding gap that exists between what airports can pay for and what they cannot. Congestion has become the norm in our country, and it's not only on our highways. It's affecting air travel as well. Terminals clogged with passengers, runways and taxiways needing additions and rehabilitation, airplanes sitting on tarmac across the country waiting for gates. There's no question that members of this committee and millions of other Americans who fly every week experience these issues. Passenger terminals across the United States, many of which were constructed in the 60s, 70s, and even 80s, are outdated, can't accommodate current or projected passenger growth, security needs as they were built pre-9/11. They do not have the space or gates needed to accommodate current airline departures and arrivals, let alone welcoming new service for communities. This, in turn, affects the price that all Americans pay for airline tickets, as well as local businesses and regional economies from coast to coast. According to ACI, when combining all funding sources available to U.S. airports, they'll still face more than $15 billion, billion dollars each year in unmet infrastructure needs. U.S. airports are doing the best they can to find ways to meet these ballooning needs, but it often leads to local communities paying twice as much and waiting twice as long for upgrades. Last year, this committee hammered out a long-term FAA authorization bill, provides robust funding for the FAA to carry out its vision, contains numerous provisions needed to advance the industry at large, but it failed to address the growing infrastructure needs of airports. In fact, by the time this authorization expires in 2023, funding levels for the FAA program for all airports, AIP, will have been flat for a total of 12 years, despite infrastructure needs growing and the cost of construction rising over the same period. The FAA forecasts over the next 5 years, U.S. airports will register a need for $35.1 billion in AIP-eligible infrastructure projects alone. That amounts to more than $7 billion a year, more than double the $3.2 billion in AIP grants that are awarded each year. So it's clear that AIP barely makes a dent in the AIP investment needs. Even when you take into account the other sources of revenue available to airports, such as state grants, airport concessions, are still billions short. Picture's even bleaker when you factor in airports' non-AIP eligible needs. ACI estimates over the next 5 years, U.S. airports will require a total investment of $128 billion or $26 billion a year. So what's the solution? What can Congress do? I'm surely not opposed to increasing the FAA's federal AIP grant levels, but we also need to look on the other side of the airport, and we need to increase the cap on the PFC. Locally imposed, federally authorized user fee, the airports may collect or not from their passengers to finance airport-related projects. Simply put, the PFC supports local decisions about what's best for airports surrounding communities. The cap has not been raised in almost 20 years. If we look back to the original authorization in 1990, the current PFC would be about $8.50 if it had been adjusted for inflation, but it has not. So it's worth about $2 compared to the original, compared to the $4.50 that Congress authorized a number of years ago. So, you know, you would think that the airlines would be willing to work with the airports on this. However, they are not. And they say that the airports have adequate resources and or they can work with their incumbent airlines to fund their passenger needs. But this ultimately can be much more expensive for the passengers, and ultimately someone's got to pay the costs, so it's going to come back on the airline leases and gates, in my opinion. You know, when we were negotiating, we're told that they have an economist who says that $2 on the PFC will cause millions of people to not fly again. I question the validity of that assertion. And in fact, while we were doing the FAA bill last fall, American Airlines, Delta Airlines, JetBlue, and United all increased their bag fees by $5. But I didn't see that their passenger boardings fell off phenomenally. You know, I question the inelasticity of demand for tickets having to do with improving the passenger experience, with the PFC, improving security, throughput, having more gates, potentially having more competition at airports, and maybe that's the real issue, is, you know, if an airport is leased out, then to build more gates, if they have to deal with the airlines, that wouldn't include a non-incumbent airline in those negotiations, would it? So I've really got to question what really is going on here. And last year, I introduced a bill with Representative Massie on this, and we had a bipartisan bill. It was not considered during the FAA authorization, The Senate previously passed an increase on this issue, and today airports collect $3.3 billion each year in PFC on the basis of $450. If they doubled, they could collect nearly $7 billion annually, but a more modest increase when combined with AIP funding would bring them a step closer to fulfilling their capital needs, but it would not fully fund them. So with that, I will yield time to the ranking member, Representative Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the hearing today. And no one denies that, that much of our nation's infrastructure is crumbling, but I do think aviation is a little bit different. Tens of billions of dollars over the past few years have been poured into our airports. And last year, Congress authorized nearly $4.5 billion annually in airport grants, and making it easier, obviously, for airports to use PFC revenues. However, as you pointed out, more passengers than ever are going to fly are going to travel through our airports this year, and demand is just only expected to grow. Therefore, reviewing our airport infrastructure investments, I think, makes a whole lot of sense. While I'm grateful to today's witnesses, I'm disappointed that we're not going to hear at least a greater diversity of perspectives. No one at today's hearing can share the perspective on mainline regional cargo airlines. Additionally, there's no one today from the finance community to discuss financing airport projects, including private capital. And finally, there's no one here who can speak to the experiences of general aviation airports. As you may know, GA airports are economic engines, and they're often the entry point into aviation for aerospace professionals. And not having these unique perspectives, I think, is a missed opportunity. Regardless, it's important to keep in mind three key points on airport investment. First, we have to understand what the actual infrastructure needs of airports are. A recently released survey states that airports have $128 billion in infrastructure needs over the next 5 years. The number is 80% higher than the same report, the very same report 4 years ago, even though passenger traffic has increased 13%. We have to make sure that we're talking about infrastructure needs and not infrastructure wants. Second, we have to make sure that private capital is a part of the solution. All commercial service airports generate revenue and therefore have the ability to attract that private capital. Let's make sure that airports can take advantage of private investment opportunities. And lastly, it's clear that airports and airlines continue to accuse each other of wanting more control. Lost in this arm wrestling is the accountability. Accountability to the passenger who already pays more than 20% in taxes and fees on every ticket. And accountability to the taxpayer who has little to say on how their airport's going to serve their community. In my district alone, voters have been sold enough versions of a new terminal for Kansas City Airport, International Airport, to make their heads spin. In terms of infrastructure, of an infrastructure package that hopefully we're going to be discussing sooner rather than later, all funding options are on the table. I'm also skeptical, though, of any proposal that adds to the traveling public's burden, fails to fully consider the views of local communities and passengers, and lacks a full range of financing options, including private capital. And with that, I look forward to the hearing today. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here, and I look forward to hearing each and every one of your testimony. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman for his brevity. I ask UC unanimous consent that the following items be entered into the record of today's hearing: submissions by 57 U.S. airports detailing their planned infrastructure projects and their current funding needs, and written testimony prepared by 7 different groups. Without objection, so ordered. Now I would move on to our witnesses. I'd like to welcome our panel, Lawrence J. Crowder, CEO, Spokane International Airport; Ms. Tori Barnes, Executive Vice President, Public Affairs, U.S. Travel Association; Ms. Candace S. Mcgraw, CEO, Cincinnati Northern Kentucky International; Mr. Joe Lopano, CEO, Tampa International Airport. Here we go, page 2. Mr. Ted Christie, CEO and President, Spirit Airlines; Mr. Mark Scribner, Senior Fellow, Competitive Enterprise Institute; Thank you all for being here today. I look forward to your testimony. Without objection, our full statements be included in the record. Your written testimony has been made part of the record. And, I would encourage members of the panel to, as much as possible, interact with one another. Statements made by others that they may disagree with or agree with, that would be useful. I have read the testimony, and as I assume have other members of the panel. So please be interesting in your 5-minute summaries. And with that, I would like to recognize Representative Massie to introduce Ms. Candace Mcgraw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to introduce my constituent. Ms. Mcgraw has been the CEO of our airport. That's the Cincinnati Northern Kentucky Airport. And yes, the Cincinnati Airport is in Kentucky since 2011. She has overseen in the last 5 years a doubling of our passenger originations and a doubling of our cargo freight there at the airport. The airport is home to DHL North American's hub and the Amazon hub, their cargo hub there. Ms. Mcgraw serves as the Airports Council International Chairperson, and her airport has been recognized as the best regional airport in North America for 7 of the last 8 consecutive years. Thanks for coming, Ms. Mcgraw.
Good morning, Chairman DeFazio. I'm sorry.
We're going to start left to right.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You sit there right to left, but you are introduced graciously by your member of Congress. So, and with that, we would turn to Mr. Crowder for his testimony.
CVG comes before GEG, so we got you that way, Candace. Good morning, Chairman DeFazio and Ranking Member Graves and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to appear again before this committee to discuss the infrastructure funding challenges facing our nation's airports, particularly from my perspective, small hub airports like Spokane. We are the primary commercial service airport for the Intermountain Northwest, serving approximately 4 million passengers a year across Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and the Canadian provinces of Alberta and British Columbia. Small hub airports like Spokane play a very large role in the economic vitality of our surrounding regions. That's why it is so important to invest in airports to maintain these engines of economic growth. We also operate Phelps Field, a top-quality general aviation airport with its own contract tower. Unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, the status quo is not working when it comes to funding the infrastructure investments that our airports desperately need. The Terminal Renovation and Expansion, or TREX project, that we are currently undertaking in Spokane is a case in point and brings the cost of doing nothing to life. Doing nothing is simply not an option for Spokane. Where our main terminal building dates back to the 1960s and our facilities are operating beyond capacity in light of recent double-digit passenger traffic growth. We launched the TREX project to address these challenges by adding gate capacity to meet rising demand and expanding our passenger screening and baggage claim facilities. The full scope of TREX is described in my written statement and summarized in the graphic that you all have in front of you this morning. The total cost of TREX is estimated at $190 million, but significant constraints on the 3 main sources of airport funding mean that we have limited options to fund this project in a fiscally prudent way. Let me start with the passenger facility charge, a fee on each enplaning passenger that was conceived by this committee as a way to fund terminal buildings and other airport projects. The $4.50 cap on PFCs has not been adjusted in nearly 20 years, meaning that its purchasing power in today's dollars is about half of what it once was. The graphic that I've included in front of you shows what this means for airports like Spokane that are trying to fund significant capital improvements like the TREX project within the constraints of a $4.50 PFC. More debt and no way to fund any new improvements beyond this immediate project with PFCs because the PFC would be extended out so far, in our case, well beyond 30 years. As you can see across the top row of the table on the graphic that I've included, the PFC cap forces us to finance investments over a longer period of time, meaning that we ultimately pay almost as much in interest as we do for the project itself, more than $151 million in interest for a $190 million project under the scenario depicted in my graphic. Moving down the graphic, however, you can see how modest increases in the PFC cap would substantially shorten our financing period and bring down our interest costs significantly, meaning that the PFC could be used to fund other projects that will be needed in the intermediate and longer terms to further improve safety, capacity, and efficiency on the behalf of airport users. The bottom right-hand corner of the table shows that with an 850 PFC cap and a combination of pay-go and bond financing, our interest costs would only amount to about $18.7 million over the term of the financing, or roughly a quarter of what they would equal with the current PFC cap, as you can see in the top right-hand corner. As airport operators, we have to ask ourselves, why should we be forced to take on crushing levels of debt that also tie up and close off this locally directed user fee for the future benefit of those that pay to use the airport, when a more fiscally prudent option of adjusting the PFC cap upward is so obvious? I focus, Mr. Chairman, on PFCs because the other two potential funding solutions commonly mentioned are even more constrained. The FAA's Airport Improvement Program is largely focused on airside, runways and taxiways, not terminal and other improvements that are more urgently needed. In fact, in reviewing the $186 million in AIP grants that Spokane has received since 1982, I could only find one grant remotely related to terminal improvements, and that was only for about $2 million, and it was out of a set-aside fund for preconditioned air units on jet bridges to reduce aircraft emissions. In addition, tapping AIP entitlement funds for terminal improvement projects that the FAA considers as relatively low priority jeopardizes discretionary AIP funding for other projects, effectively closing off this resource. Finally, our net operating revenues are dedicated to paying for items that do not qualify for either PFC or AIP support. Things like paying to construct parking lots and aircraft hangars, buying police vehicles and shuttle buses, and building administrative space. A crushing debt load would harm the ability of the airport to generate sufficient operating revenues net of debt service to fund these important projects that are not eligible for PFC or AIP participation. Bottom line, Mr. Chairman, is that increasing the PFC is the most viable way to increase funding for improvements to our nation's airports infrastructure. The cost of doing nothing is simply too high, and represented by the unreasonable concessions and contortions that we must make to fit our capital improvement projects into the confines of our current funding system, as well as the many projects that never actually get off the ground. This is not the way that a nation committed to building world-class infrastructure should fund its airports. I strongly urge this committee to come together on a bipartisan basis to properly and equitably fund our nation's airports infrastructure by increasing the PFC. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today and look forward to answering questions.
We would move on to the next witness, which would be Ms. Mcgraw. What? Barnes? Oh, sorry. Ms. Barnes, sorry. She's so anxious to go.
Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, members of the committee, good morning. I'm Tori Barnes, Executive Vice President of Public Affairs and Policy for the U.S. Travel Association. Thank you for inviting the broader travel industry to participate in this important hearing. U.S. Travel is the only association that represents the interests of travelers in all sectors of the travel industry: lodging companies, amusement parks, restaurants, convention managers, car rental companies, state travel leaders, and many others. With such a broad membership, our association has a focused mission to increase travel to and within the United States, and that's the lens through which we evaluate public policies. Simply put, will they grow travel or not? This is our approach to aviation policy, because when air travel grows, the benefits exceed far beyond just airports and airlines. In 2018, domestic air travelers spent $289 billion and directly supported 2.4 million jobs in America's travel industry. International travel to the U.S. is our nation's second largest service export, and more than 85% of the spending is powered by the 51 million international visitors arriving at our airports. Clearly, when air travel grows, our economy prospers. That means it's essential for America's infrastructure to keep pace with growing demand. As our members look at the passenger facility charge, they raise three questions. First, are airports able to handle current demand? Travelers already face routine challenges from delays and a frustrating passenger experience, often stuck in crowded terminals or on congested taxiways. In 2018, 1 in 5 flights was delayed or canceled. A recent U.S. travel survey found that airport hassles caused Americans to avoid 32 million trips, which cost travel businesses $24 billion in spending, enough to support 200,000 jobs. Second, will airports be able to handle future demand? Here, there are real concerns. The FAA predicts that 9 large hub airports will not have enough airside capacity to meet demand by 2030. According to a study by Cambridge Systematics, by 2021, the top 30 U.S. airports will experience Thanksgiving-like congestion levels at least 1 day per week. So if you happen to fly on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, just look around. It's a preview of the average day of air travel will look like in just a few short years if we continue down this current path. Third, our members asked, how would flyers react if Congress raises the PFC? We surveyed air travelers around the country and learned that their top 3 frustrations are airline fees, the overall cost of flying, and airport hassles such as crowded terminals. Airport fees were second to last as factors determining whether travelers actually take trips. Travelers also support projects that improve travel, and they know that these projects must be paid for. 58% said that they would be willing to pay up to $4 more per ticket for airport improvement projects of the kind that the PFCs fund. That leads me to why U.S. Travel supports giving airports the choice to raise the PFC. Because 1, it's optional. 2, it funds projects that benefit travelers and the air travel system, and it works. As I stated, the PFC is an optional tool that airports may choose, and I emphasize choose, to address projects of immediate need that also receive the FAA's approval. PFCs only fund projects that benefit the entire air travel system, projects that strengthen safety and security, reduce congestion, and enhance airline competition. Travelers support such investments, and they know that they will grow travel. Finally, the PFC works. Consider O'Hare Airport. O'Hare used PFC funds to buy out and renovate vacant gates held by a major incumbent carrier. This action helped several low-cost carriers, including Spirit, start new service, and their flights to new cities led to 2 million additional visitors and over $2 billion in increased business activity over a 7-year period. For airports that choose it, PFCs work, and they grow travel. Giving airports the option to increase the PFC has the backing of the broad span of the travel industry, including 147 organizations that announced their support last year. These travel leaders are convinced that adjusting the PFC cap will boost, not hurt travel. Thank you for your leadership in ensuring a better air travel system for passengers. We look forward to working with you on this and other important issues, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, and thanks for your brevity. Now we will move on to Ms. Mcgraw.
Now, thank you. Good morning, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, and thank you to Mr. Massie for the kind introduction. It's an honor to appear before you today, and before I begin, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for your public service. I'm here to share the story of CVG and offer you the perspective of a medium hub airport. One of the most important things I hope you take away from today is that airports are running out of time for Congress to remove the outdated cap on the PFC. Our airports are aging. Our terminals are woefully inadequate relative to keeping pace with the growth in passenger demand and processing. Airports have investments to make now. We have jobs to support and create today. The ongoing, long-suffering arm wrestling between airports and airlines that you hear about is about one issue alone, and that's control. Airports want to work with, not for, airlines to the benefit of our communities. Let me share with you the example of CVG, which today operates very differently than it once did. Like my colleagues in Pittsburgh and St. Louis, CVG was historically dominated by a single carrier who operated a major connecting hub. The airport's long-term 40-year use agreement imposed significant restrictions on what the airport could do, how decisions were made, and what funds could be spent on capital projects. Average airfares from CVG were among the highest in the country. We had little funding in reserve for operating or capital costs. When the dominant airline reorganized under bankruptcy and merged with another in the late 2000s, CVG experienced what many of my new medium hub colleagues have faced, a dehubbing and downsizing of operations that required us to reinvent the essence of the airport. In the time since, we have right-sized the facilities, consolidating 3 terminals and 3 concourses into a single main terminal with 2 concourses. We demolished our oldest facilities to free up valuable space to lower our operating costs. We started developing airport property that would never be used for aviation purposes for non-aeronautical projects to diversify our revenue streams and create more jobs for our region. My team and I doubled down on operating the airport as the business it is. We focused on diversifying our business, keeping costs low for all of our tenants and airline partners, while maintaining prudent reserves. It's said that airports do not need increased local revenues and should simply work collaboratively with airlines to accomplish major capital projects. CVG is one of the best examples of what can happen when an airport or any business is overly reliant on one or a handful of business partners to achieve success. For as much success as we have had with our hub carrier, artificial limitations were placed on us for spending money or in creating competition on routes. Our success today is reflective of what happens when you empower good business management, operate more effectively at a local level, and create a level playing field for all business partners to flourish. Later this year, we will submit to the FAA our 2050 master plan, a 30-year outlook on the airport's infrastructure plan for growing and meeting capacity forecasts. The first order of items to support the master plan will be to maximize the use of the existing passenger facilities. We plan to repair, replace, and upgrade basic mechanical systems, jet loading bridges, conveyances, and baggage systems. In addition to required airfield projects such as taxiway and runway rehabilitations, these passenger facility improvements are in urgent need of attention, not from a cosmetic standpoint, but rather to meet operational readiness and reliability objectives. Our former hub carrier is responsible for ongoing maintenance of certain assets at the airport until the end of 2020. As of January 2021, CVG will have to assume the operating costs and responsibility for our outdated 25-year-old baggage facilities and passenger train, which were designed for connecting travelers. While 90% of our passengers were connecting during our hub days, local passengers now account for over 90% of our activity, a record level and a 97% increase since 2012. CVG's current 5-year capital program shows a need for $468 million in projects by 2024, nearly 30% of which is PFC eligible, about $137 million. The initial phase of our master plan is calling for approximately $500 million in additional terminal renovation and expansion costs between 2025 and 2030. Currently, CVG has imposed a $4.50 PFC, which is the maximum level allowed. For my airport, the PFC revenues we currently and will continue to collect are almost entirely allocated to, 1, reimbursing capital projects such as a runway that was constructed in the early 2000s at the request of our dominant carrier, and 2, paying down a PFC-backed bond that financed a new entrance road to accommodate increased local passenger volume. Should the PFC cap be lifted to $8.50 and be indexed to inflation going forward, our ability to fund capital projects on a pay-go basis changes significantly. We estimate the ability to fund an additional $340 million in new PFC project costs while still meeting debt service coverage requirements. The next phase of our terminal improvement may be needed as early as 2027. With an increased PFC, we may be able to save about 2.5 years in completing such projects. We estimate saving $83 million in interest costs alone if additional PFC revenue is available, and will thereby avoid having to pass costs onto our airline partners in their operating rate base.
If you could quickly summarize.
I'll be done in one moment. Airports are drivers of economic development for our regions, not just in direct jobs, but for the way we manage our assets to benefit communities. Unlike our airline partners, airport assets are not mobile. We are the only constants for our communities. As time has demonstrated, carriers will come and go, decide to merge, or have to dissolve. As cited in the CVG examples, it takes years of focused strategy to rebuild if a single carrier picks
Okay,
up and moves their operations. I want to thank you. I'm closing now. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Okay. I would suggest, and at the future, I'm going to probably not allow people to read testimony, would be to summarize your best points and, if possible, respond to points that others have made or are going to make. Anyway, we'd move on now to Mr. Lopano with Tampa.
Morning, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, and all members of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee. Thank you for inviting me to participate today. I'm Joe Lopano. I'm CEO of Tampa International Airport. We're the 29th largest airport in the country and one of 4 large hub airports in Florida. This past year, we broke our previous passenger number record with a record 21 million travelers. and we're expected to grow to 22 million this year. This is up from 16 million in 2011 when I became CEO. This growth would not have been possible without the passenger facility charge. That has allowed us to expand the airport while keeping our costs low and enhancing airline competition to benefit consumers. When I was hired, my board directed me to increase international service to Tampa Bay. New airlines expressed interest, but we needed to expand our international facility to accommodate them. The project cost was $25.8 million. Our airline agreement requires any project with an investment of more than $10 million to have approval from our signatory airlines. Our incumbent carriers made it explicitly clear they had no intention of supporting a project that would bring in competitors. Fortunately, we had access to PFC funds and a grant from the Florida Department of Transportation, bringing the airport revenue portion down to $2 million and allowing us to proceed without airline approval. Once the project was done, we brought in new flights, increasing our international traffic by 150%, even before Delta starts flying nonstop service to Amsterdam. This has resulted in a $1.6 billion economic impact to our region and nearly 18,000 jobs. So, Mr. Chairman, to your point about summarizing, I can't give you a better example than that of a project when the airlines say, name a project that's not going to get built. I just gave you one. And it turned into 150% in international traffic to Tampa. So I will yield my time, Mr. Chairman.
Didn't it also bring in other domestic competition? You might summarize that
Okay.
in your testimony, too.
Very, very good. Let me see if I can find it here.
Don't be traumatized by the fact that I...
I'm trying to follow the rules. I don't come up here every day.
No, I know. You've got a lot of time left, so
Okay, okay. So,
But that was another factor. I saw a significant decrease, as I recall, in reading your testimony, you had new entrants
Yes.
and domestic fees on at least one nonstop route change.
yes. We've also seen growth on the domestic side, adding competition in more than half of our domestic markets, driving down fares. We've added service to small and medium hub airports, including Greensboro and Asheville in North Carolina, Syracuse, New York, Latrobe, Pennsylvania, and Madison, Wisconsin, to name a few. Many of these flights are on ultra-low-cost carriers who are attracted to our airport because our cost per enplanement is low, thanks to our responsible financial management and the PFC. The PFC, as currently conceived, has reached its limit. The fee has not been modernized since 2001, and inflation has whittled away its spending power. Stuck at $450, it is not adequate to responsibly address the $81 billion in capital needs at the 30 large hub airports nationwide. Tampa alone needs $2.2 billion capital investment over the next 15 years. About half of that could be paid for using the PFC, but our PFC capacity is only $300 million. This has major implications for the future of the airport and our new international terminal. I do have some information on what you're talking about. What happened was JetBlue was flying to Boston, and we brought in low-cost carriers, ultra-low-cost carriers like Spirit, and we had a reduction in the fare of, what's the percent? Reduced the fare by $30 in that market. That's only one example. It happens all the time when you bring in competition. You lower the fares, you stimulate the market. I think that the issue here is control and competition. And you said earlier, it's about letting the local people make their decisions on what they need to build and how they should build it. That's what we're after with this PFC increase. We don't come up here just because we think it's fun. We do actually need the money.
Okay. Thank you. I know it's not fun. And thank you all for being here and traveling here and doing your testimony. With that, we would move on to Ted Christie, President and CEO of Spirit Airlines.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Graves, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Ted Christie. I'm the President and CEO of Spirit Airlines. For those of you who may not know Spirit, we are the largest so-called ultra-low-cost carrier in the U.S. We serve about 50 U.S. domestic airports and over 20 international destinations. Our total prices, including all ancillary products and services, are, on average, about 30% less than those of other airlines in the U.S. Corporate travelers and affluent customers may have many choices in today's market. Spirit's product is designed for highly price-sensitive consumers, mainly middle-class Americans who pay for their own tickets. Spirit strongly supports the objective of improving airport infrastructure in the U.S. We have seen a boom in airport projects, with nearly $165 billion in projects since 2008 at the nation's large airports. Smaller airports are also making investments. Strong passenger demand has driven airport revenues way up, and most U.S. airports are in excellent financial health. Today, airports enjoy investment-grade bond ratings in an era of historically low interest rates. Capital is cheap and looking for well-designed projects in airports. Airlines themselves have invested billions in airport projects, and that's despite the fact that most of us do not have investment-grade bond ratings or as easy access to capital markets as most airports. In this historically favorable environment, we don't think an increase in the PFC maximum is the best tool for funding airport infrastructure projects. Most airports, including those appearing before the committee today, may like to see an increase in PFCs. We shouldn't be surprised. But increasing PFCs by any amount, let alone doubling the current cap to $8 or more, is not the right answer to the problem we are all trying to solve. PFCs are a consumer tax, and the traveling consumers are already punishingly taxed. Over $60 of the average round-trip fare of about $300 is the government's taxes and fees. That's too much. Take a family of 4 going for a vacation. If the PFC cap is raised to $8 per segment, that increase puts the total round-trip PFC bite at $64, a real number to consider for many middle-class families. Families who must connect through big cities would see double that amount, or $128. PFCs are a flat assessment. Like most government fees affecting travelers, based on a single leg or itinerary. They are therefore regressive and hit ordinary consumers the hardest, those who travel at the lower price point. I will concede that many business travelers may not notice an increase in PFCs. They tend to travel at short notice and pay higher walk-up fares. Usually, their employer is paying anyway. But Spirit customers pay an average about $110 each way, including all ancillary charges. So for them, the proposed increase is material. Our discretionary travelers have high demand elasticity in reaction to even modest price changes. If travel prices rise, they will travel less. We believe we should be seeking ways to hold the line or even lower the tax burden for ordinary consumers, not increase it. A related point, value airlines like Spirit typically use limited airport facilities more efficiently than other airlines. We run more passengers per day through each airport gate, and we occupy less terminal space for a given volume of passengers. By the way, airports and local communities appreciate that we can deliver more passengers through limited facilities. Yet each of our customers subsidizes the airport facility at the same per-person PFC rate. PFC's one-size-fits-all nature ignores the differentiation among our nation's airports and their individual needs. Airports vary by size, by function in the national network, by which airlines serve them, and by the status of their improvement programs. I want to underline that despite some differences on the PFC issue, airlines and airports have a constructive relationship across the country. We work together to serve our communities, to improve facilities, and to invest in the consumer experience. Our challenges and priorities are shared, not separate. I'd say Spirit enjoys an excellent relationship with all our host airports. Going back to the beginning of these comments, I, like other airlines, Spirit wants to improve airport infrastructure. We stand ready to meet and work with you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee in finding a constructive and creative solution to this problem. Thank you again.
Thank you. I'm told the timer isn't working down there, but you did very well. You had 44 seconds left. And I apologize, this isn't our real hearing room. We will hopefully have one starting in May. And then also we'll be able to do roundtables and other more flexible things. And with that, I'd turn to Mr. Scribner.
Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the committee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify before you on the importance of airport development. Like other witnesses, I'll focus on the passenger facility charge and why it should be modernized to encourage more and smarter airport investment. As you said, Mr. Chairman, the PFC is a congressionally authorized, federally regulated local airport user fee. It exists as an exception to the general federal prohibition on state and local taxes and fees on air travelers, which was enacted in 1973, 1 year after airlines lost a major constitutional case on local user fees at the U.S. Supreme Court. By the 1980s, this had led to growing concerns over excessive airport reliance on federal aid and reduced airline competition, leading the Reagan administration to begin developing the concept of what ultimately became the PFC in 1990. Under current law, public airports in the U.S. can charge a maximum PFC of $4.50 per passenger enplanement for the first 2 enplanements of a one-way itinerary. The PFC exists alongside the Airport Improvement Program, or AIP, a federal grant program funded through aviation taxes. Together, the PFC and AIP account for approximately half of total airport funding available for capital projects. AIP funds can generally be used for airside projects, such as runways, taxiways, aprons, noise abatement, and land acquisitions. In contrast, the PFC funds can be used for AIP-eligible projects, plus numerous landside projects at passenger terminals, and importantly, the PFC can be used to service debt. For commercial airports with sizable passenger volumes, these differences in flexibility have led to a strong preference for the PFC over AIP funding. Unfortunately, Congress has left the PFC cap unchanged since 2000, eroding the purchasing power of the PFC and limiting airport investment options. Two recent research findings support the case for PFC modernization. First, evidence suggests that PFC use has a positive effect on airport productive efficiency, while AIP use has a negative effect. Legislation introduced in the previous Congress would have uncapped the PFC while proportionally reducing AIP authorized spending. This change in the PFC-AIP mix was expected to result in greater airport productive efficiency. The bill, introduced by Chairman DeFazio and Representative Massie, would have allowed for increased total airport investment while simultaneously reducing federal spending. That's a win-win in my book, and why most leading free market libertarian and conservative organizations have supported this approach. In addition to CEI joining Democratic and Republican members of Congress, scholars and advocates from the Reason Foundation, Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, Tax Foundation, FreedomWorks, and Citizens Against Government Waste have endorsed modernizing the PFC along the lines of the Investing in America, Rebuilding America's Airport Infrastructure Act. Support for the PFC transcends party or ideology. It's just good policy. Second, major non-aeronautical revenue sources, namely revenue from parking and rental car fees, are facing heightened risks and declining prospects as travelers opt for new ride-hailing ground transportation services to and from airports. Since the PFC is collected from airport users regardless of their use of airport concessions, it represents low-risk, predictable, and sustainable user-based revenue. Besides providing airports with predictable and sustainable revenue, the PFC was also designed to promote airline competition. Beginning in the 1950s, airports often turned to their airline customers to retire debt and finance airport improvements. In exchange for this financial support, incumbent airlines received long-term exclusive use gate leases, which were then used to restrict access to new and often lower-cost carrier entrants. In more recent times, airports entering into long-term exclusive use gate leases has become less common than in the past, but limited gate availability at large and medium hub airports has still been estimated to raise consumer airfares by billions of dollars every year, dwarfing total annual nationwide PFC collections. In this way, the PFC serves as an important airport self-help tool that can dilute price-setting power by dominant incumbent airlines, thereby benefiting air travelers in the form of lower airfares as well as improved airport facilities. Further expanding the purchasing power of the PFC by eliminating the statutory cap and with a focus on improving airline competition, especially through the expansion of common use gates available to new carrier entrants, could result in substantial airfare savings for consumers. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity to testify before the committee, and I welcome your questions.
Excellent, thank you. I appreciate your brevity. Let's move on now to questions. First, to Mr. Crowder, because you've made the case about dramatic savings if you do a preemptive PFC or if you do a PFC in conjunction with bonding. If you went the route of full bonding with the very high interest costs, how would you recapture that money? Would that have anything to do with your cost per employment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Right now, the cost of fully bonding out the TREX project is a little over $342 million. We would anticipate funding that entirely with our PFC obligation authority, which right now means that that charge would go out 38 years.
Okay. But what I'm getting at is someone has to pay, okay? Now, if you don't do it with a PFC on the passengers, then you've got to recoup the money in some other way. And don't you have relatively low CPEs, correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And that would mean in the future, perhaps if you expanded capacity and a new airline like Spirit wanted to come in, would your CPEs have to go up for the new entrants?
They would, and in my written testimony, I talk about the fact that that serves as a trap in this conversation because airports have limits in how high that CPE can be driven. And as a practical matter, if we had to finance tracks just through the airline rate base, it would drive our CPE incredibly high, well above our peer airports. Even though we're in the lowest quartile today, that would probably place us among the most expensive small hub airports in the country.
Okay, thank you. For the 3 airports are here, back in August, just before we passed the FAA bill, American, Delta, JetBlue, United, all raised bag fees by $5. Did any of those 3 airports see a dramatic drop-off in passengers on those airlines during that time period? Yes.
We're seeing our highest growth rate since I got there 8 years ago. In
I
fact,
don't think a $5 increase in the bag fee drove down boardings.
I'm only going by the numbers. We're
Okay,
up 10%.
All right. Anybody else see a decrease? I'm just trying to get at this price elasticity argument. I did study economics in undergraduate and graduate school. I'm just confused about the differences, the variables in price elasticity. If it's a bag fee, you thank them. But if it's a PFC, so you can get through security faster, you might have a lower price ticket, you might have more competition, you'll have a better airport experience, you'll never fly again.
Mr. Chairman, we're experiencing record growth at CVG as well. There's been no decrease in passengers.
Okay. Interesting. So to Spokane again, Alaska says that a $4.50 increase will discourage air travel. Are they one of your incumbent airlines?
Yes, sir, they are. They are the busiest incumbent airline in our market.
And they said that if your fee went up by $4.50, that they would have no choice except to raise airfares or reduce service. Do you buy that argument?
I don't, and for the same reasons that you've stated, is that we have seen ancillary fees continue to increase considerably year after year with no negative impact on travel in Spokane. In fact, we are setting new records for travel every year.
Okay. And then to Mr. Scribner, you had a pretty extraordinary number here. Economists have estimated that airfares are $5.6 billion higher in 2017 than they would be with adequate gate access to support new carrier entrants at large and mid-sized airports. Could you just expand on that a little bit? I mean, you really think that bringing in more airlines or different airlines would lower ticket prices for people?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. Absolutely, and we've seen it play out at airports across the country. This has long been an issue. And this issue, in fact, predates the PFC, in part because the way we set up funding in the 70s and by outlawing more independent airport revenue sources, we saw them drive into the hands of the airlines and become more beholden to federal funding and those strings attached, rather than focusing on these competitive pressures. So I think absolutely if we had more freedom at the airports to make these decisions, to bring in new low-cost carriers, I think we'd see lower airfares.
Okay, thank you. With that, my time's expired. Turn to, oh, you want me to? Okay. I will first turn to Representative Webster. You're number 1 on the list. Thank Graves.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's see, Ms. Barnes, you have, wouldn't you say your organization, the members of that would have you would have the closest ear to the ground on what's going on in traffic and in travel and costs and so forth?
Well, to answer the previous question, in a recent survey that we conducted of travelers, we found that government-issued fees, such as a PFC, was the second lowest of deterrents to travel. So based on the data that we've seen, we don't see that travel would be negatively impacted. In fact, 10% of travelers that avoid trips due as a result of hassles with airports, delays and cancellations. So we believe that improvements to the airport and increasing the PFC to be indexed with inflation would be helpful for all of our industry. We represent almost 1,300 members, and our industry is fully supportive of increasing the PFC to help with these infrastructure needs.
Would you say that in that polling, did you check the awareness of even the awareness of the PFC?
I don't know that we spoke exactly to the awareness, but we do have data that demonstrates when travelers understand that an increased PFC goes to help infrastructure at their airport, they're even more inclined to support a PFC than just on the general question of, do you support a PFC? So the more they know about it, the more likely they are to support it.
So if they know that this is only going to be used at that particular airport, then there's a higher desire to have maybe an increase?
I can get back to you to know about that nuance, but that would be where the data suggests yes.
Mr. Lupano, you're in Florida, my state. You get a lot of traffic. And we depend on tourism as one of our largest revenue producers. Would you say that most of your flights are not pass-through flights, they're final destinations?
I'm sorry, would you repeat the question,
Would
sir?
you say that most of the incoming flights that you have are, Tampa is their final destination?
Yes, we're well above 90% just origin and destination. We have very few connecting passengers.
So for you, you're dealing in a lot of ways with people who are coming there, which seems like they would be maybe a little more reactionary to any kind of increase in cost. Have you done polling like the U.S. Travel or?
We have not on our own, but we rely on U.S. Travel to conduct that on our behalf.
So, but from just the results of travel itself, there has been a large increase, and you feel like that would continue no matter what that cost would be.
Absolutely. I think that, I mean, let's put it this way. As the chairman said, someone's got to pay the bill. So you can either raise the PFC by $4 or $4.50, or we'll just load the airport up with debt and increase the cost to the airlines. And so I find it curious that the airlines want us to load up with debt, not use the PFC. The PFC would not affect their O&M cost. PFC bonds are on the side. You can either increase the PFC and not increase cost to the airlines, or you can increase costs to the airlines and make your CPE go up, which I think would be an anti-competitive result.
Anyone else have an opinion on that?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
If I may,
Right.
I do have a comment on that. As I mentioned in my prepared remarks, the PFC is an amount that's borne eventually by the consumer. So while it may not be included in the cost per enplaned passenger that was referenced by the airports here, it is included in the total price paid. And so if the cost per enplaned passenger is $5 and the CPE is $4.50, it's $9.50. And so, as I mentioned before, we are very much in favor of airport improvement projects, but our view is that this particular fee is regressive for low-fare carriers. As I mentioned earlier, our total cost of travel is $110 one way. And the reason we are able to offer such low fares to our consumers is asset efficiency. We are more efficient with our airplanes, we are more efficient with our own headquarters, with our hangar facility, and we are more efficient with the assets that we lease at airports. And in doing so, we actually can defray the expense in rents and charges with more volume. And that's why it's important for us that the best way, we think the most efficient way for financing airport improvement projects is by raising very efficient capital markets debt and passing it through to the airlines in rents and charges, which we can be more efficient with.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back for that and for holding this meeting. It's very, very important.
Thank you. With that, it would be, oh. Sorry, you would have been next, but she just came back. Are you prepared right now, Eleanor, to ask your question? Okay, then let's move on to Andre.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm very glad we're holding this hearing on this very important issue. Some of my friends who oppose updating and even increasing the PFC have claimed that airports can always raise money or access money through municipal bonds. As a former member of the Indianapolis City County Council, I'm guessing these folks have never sat through a council meeting. So to today's witnesses, how would you recommend responding to this assertion?
If I may, Mr. Chairman?
Let's go.
Mr. Carson?
Let's go.
While I have not sat through a council meeting, so I cannot opine, in my experience in dealing with the various investment banks that offer the assistance to the airport authorities for raising money, it has been described of late as a very liquid, a very robust, and a very inexpensive market. And as a participant, by the way, and it was referenced earlier that Spirit may have been a beneficiary in the O'Hare Airport project that led to additional gate capacity. While we did add gate capacity at O'Hare, it's difficult to determine exactly the source of funding that produced that gate capacity because there's a lot of money going back and forth. And we were actually a participant in the overall new aircraft or airline use agreement at the airport that allowed the airport to construct a completely renovated terminal, add gate capacity, but raise public funding to do so. So at least in that particular example, we felt like that was the right answer.
Yes, sir.
May I?
Sure.
Sir, okay. So just because we have really good credit ratings and the market's liquid, that doesn't mean we don't need an increase in the PFC. The PFC is one piece of the pie. It's one tool that we use. It's been a good tool since it was introduced, and it's part of what we need to fund the future. We like having very good credit ratings as airports. We get good interest rates, but we get them because we've had access to the PFC. So they are interdependent.
If I may, in looking at our own capital plan at CVG, if we funded it going forward with just a $4.50 PFC, we would have to raise our CPE by almost 50% on average between now and 2030. And we have an extraordinarily low CPE, but nonetheless, going up 50% is a huge increase for the airlines. To the point that Mr. Lopano made earlier, if it was raised to $8.50, and again, that's optional, we would look at our overall financing plan and decide if that was the right dollar amount. But say it were $8.50 under the current financing plan, the airline CPE would only increase 15%. So again, it's yet another tool to balance out an airport's overall financing structure.
Thank you.
Representative Carson,
Yes, sir.
just quickly, I have sat through a lot of city council meetings in my career, and the question that we talk about is, how are you going to pay for this? Because the airport is financially self-sufficient. The taxpayers do not support the airport. The users support the airport. And so, Airport Administrator, how are you going to provide the revenue for sale of bonds to support the debt service on those bonds? And I think my colleagues have answered that well, but that's really what it comes down to, is that being financially self-sufficient, taxpayers do not generally support the airport. We have to have the user fees in order to support debt service.
And one final point, airlines no longer sign on to 30-year use agreements the way they did previously. So an airport incurring debt for 30 years to build a runway, terminal improvements, whatever, that carrier may not be there after 5 years or so. You know, they have mobile assets. They'll decide to go elsewhere. Meanwhile, that debt is still carried on the airport's balance sheet.
Thank you. Very helpful. Chairman, I yield back.
Okay, with that, Mr. Massie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Mcgraw, would you say that competition has driven down prices at the CVG airport?
Yes, Mr. Massie. So in the last 4 years, because we've been able to grow the number of carriers at CVG, our average airfare is down now $255 on one ticket than it was 4 years ago. Traditionally, using DOT rankings, we were traditionally the highest airfare airport, and now we rank about number 83 in the list of the top 100 airports, simply for the fact of competition.
And so would the PFC, the fact that your airport could raise its own revenues through a PFC, would that mean more competition among the airlines or less competition?
I would conjecture, sir, it would mean more competition. We would be able to fund certain projects within the terminal that would enhance competition, that would level the playing field amongst various carriers. You know, I referenced earlier, when we take over facilities that our hub carrier had been maintaining under a contractual basis, that will raise overall CPE for all carriers about $1.20. If we were able to use the PFC to improve and enhance the efficiencies, that would lower the cost overall for the carriers and therefore increase competition.
Mr. Christie, what does Spirit charge to check a bag on your airline?
Thank you, Mr. Macy. Spirit has a variety of ancillary products available, including a check bag, a carry-on bag, and a seat assignment. And those prices vary depending on which bag it is. But what's more important to our consumer is the total cost of the travel. And the total cost to travel on Spirit is, on average, about 30% less than other airlines and $110.
So could you answer my question?
It varies. It can be anywhere from $25 to $50.
Okay, so here on the internet, it says $55 for carry-on, $52 for first check bag.
Again, it depends on the time of day and when you've actually purchased the ticket at the airport or, yes.
Okay,
So,
$50, and is there any federal cap on what you could charge for a check bag?
no, there is none.
Ms. Mcgraw, what are you allowed to charge to use the entire airport for a person that buys a plane ticket?
Currently, relative to PFC, we charge the
PFC.
maximum of $4.50 for those projects that have been clearly identified and approved. And I must note that we had only gone up to $4.50 within the last several years because of the type of projects that were funded. We had traditionally been at $3.
So the airlines can charge $50 for a bag, and you can't charge $5 to use the whole airport?
No, sir, and those are the same bags that they're going through an outdated bag system that needs to be updated.
That you have to start maintaining in 2020?
Yes, sir.
Wow. So one of the oppositions that I hear to allowing airports to charge a higher PFC is that you'll build amusement parks or something, or things that you don't need, or that you don't have a list of things that you would actually do. What are a couple things you would spend the money on?
Well, first order of business, we would update the baggage system. We would overhaul our mechanical systems, our HVAC system, things like that are well over 25 years old in the newest part of the terminal. We have portions of our terminals that date back to the 70s. So some of those basic behind-the-wall things need to be taken care of first order of business. Then we would look to other things, additional ticket counters, et cetera. As to building Taj Mahals, I would say if a PFC were to be increased to, say, the maximum cap would be $850, it would be incumbent upon good airport management with their airport boards to look at what the appropriate projects were. That does not mean that all airports would go to $850. It's optional, as Ms. Barnes had said.
Right. Ms. Barnes, I want to ask you a question. I have been at city council meetings, and I've had to sit through that. In fact, I was a county executive, and once I heard a story from a constituent who was very compelling and of why I should intervene against his neighbor. And the county attorney came to me, who was also a family court lawyer, and said, remember, there are three sides to every story. There's his side, her side, and the truth in a family court hearing. So, Ms. Barnes, I think you're here to represent the truth, because I trust the airports are going to represent their side and the airlines will represent their side. I trust them to act in their own best interest, but you're acting in the interest of people who make money from the travel and of the travelers. So can you comment on your opinion on PFCs?
Sure. So we find that there are 32 million trips that are being avoided due to airport hassles right now, long lines, flight delays, cancellations. That's, on average 2 to 3 trips per year, $24 billion in lost spending, and a 10% reduction in demand. So we feel that an increase of the PFC to the $8.50 would significantly help the traveler want to get on that plane, want to go to that airport, and we think that that's obviously best for the 1,300 organizations that we represent. But most importantly, improving the traveler experience is critical.
My time has expired. I don't want to get you in trouble, so I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Next on our side would be Representative Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate this hearing. But I am curious, and actually this is a question for the 3 state airports that are here. The Congress just passed, just last year, a 5-year FAA reauthorization bill. So I am curious, 1 year later, why are the airports back asking for an infrastructure package?
I can start the response,
Yes,
Congressman
please.
Norton. AIP has been flat for about 12 years in terms of appropriations from Congress. At $3.35 billion annually, airports are receiving $3.2 billion after expenses are removed off the top of the program to actually run the AIP program at FAA and a few other items. The effective buying power of AIP, because of that, is only about $1.8 billion. So in Spokane, we receive approximately $5 million of AIP entitlement funding a year. Those entitlement funds are really only worth about $2.25 million. So for us to make up the ground that we would need to make up from AIP, I just estimated, based on what I use in PFC money to supplement for a lack of AIP, I could support another $1.77 in PFC charge alone just to try to make up for what I'm forced to try to subsidize now because of the lack of AIP funding.
Yes, it sounds like you say you need annual funding.
Well, we certainly do, and we believe that the most efficient way to do that is actually through an increase in the passenger facility charge.
Okay. Yes.
Well, thank you. There's definitely the need to infuse additional money into the aviation system. We're appreciative of the AIP funding. As Mr. Crowder said, though, that's been level for a number of years. This is one tool, the PFC, that would allow more funding into making airport improvements. So I think while we're appreciative of AIP, it doesn't go far enough, and the infrastructure needs are great. So this is one tool with the PFC that we're seeking assistance with.
Wasn't there another state airport that?
Yes, Congresswoman. Give you an example, we just completed a $1 billion Phase 1 master plan project, which included an automated people mover and improvements to the terminal and so on. And of the $1 billion, only $3 million was from AIP.
Yeah.
It's just de minimis.
Yeah. Well, it sounds to me as though what you're saying is you need another source of funding.
Exactly. And that source, the most effective source, would be an increase in the PFC.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Okay, I thank the gentlelady. Oh, okay, we're changing the order. Okay, Mr. Parrott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Folks, I appreciate your time coming to Washington, D.C. and testify and answer questions. I think we can all agree that investment in our airports is critical to safe and secure operations. And along that line, I'd like to ask about another critical issue with potential impact to normal airport operations, and that's about drones. They seem like they could be an important tool for security, for monitoring FOD on the runway, what have you. But there's been reports about alleged drone sightings that have prompted what's characterized in my question here as brief runway closures, although I imagine if you're running the airport or if you're sitting on the taxiway waiting to take off, there's nothing brief about it, even if it's for a minute, and it hasn't been brief in that regard. But would remote identification requirements solve a lot of these problems, in your opinion, and would it allow law enforcement to quickly identify and address any drone that is in the area, but also determine whether or not a drone is even present? And I just say, from my standpoint, I was disappointed to see this week that the FAA pushed back the date it plans to publish a remote identification proposal, and especially for the airport executives. Can you explain the importance, if you think there is one, to this policy and regarding the FAA's actions on the delay and how that might impact your operations? And I would appeal to the first 3 or 4 witnesses, but certainly anybody can answer.
Let me try to answer that one for you.
Sure.
At Tampa, we've just installed antennas that can detect Chinese manufactured drones, which is about a certain Chinese manufacturer, about 80% of the drones. And it can tell us exactly where it is, where the operator is, and we can have law enforcement respond to exactly the location. But I think the broader point that you're making is that since this PFC has been adjusted in 2000, a lot of things have happened, like 9/11. The security environment is completely different. We now have cybersecurity issues that could be funded by PFCs. We now have active shooter issues where we have to constantly train for active shooters. The world is completely different. Biometric exit and entry. All these technologies didn't exist when the PFC was envisioned, so that's even more reason for modernizing it and changing it, moving it up.
Can I ask where how much does something like that cost? Where did you get the technology? And is that proprietary? I mean, you know, we're looking for the FAA's rule on this thing, and while we're waiting on that, you know, as you said, the world keeps moving forward. But just to inform members of the committee, you know, you've still got to run your airport. So how did you go about that?
There's a lot of technical issues in that answer, and I am not ready to answer it here, but I'd be happy to send you all the information. Just suffice it to say that it's an entirely different world now, and there are things that we never envisioned, and we definitely need funding for safety, and the PFC was intended to fund safety projects.
Okay. Anybody else?
Thank you, Representative Perry. I would just echo Mr. Lopano's comments in the sense that I believe that airports have not been given a significant enough role in crafting and participating into the regulatory process, because a lot of this is obviously local driven. And I think, as Mr. Lopano points out, if we could have more local tools to help us in dealing with this potential threat of how drones could be used against airports, I think that would be very helpful. I think that there are many communities around the country, mine included, that are looking for strong signals from the federal government on how they should go about enforcing, adopting, and they're looking to the airports as a subject matter experts to help them figure out that policy. So I'm awaiting that action just as eagerly as you are, sir.
Okay. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
I would just add that we believe strongly that you cannot have travel without strong security. So I echo the comments of my colleagues up here. One of the positive impacts of increasing the PFC are just the benefits that the security systems the strength of the security systems and how those improvements are so critical to the traveler. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance.
I thank the gentleman. Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I apologize for being somewhat redundant, but when we just have one question before us, these things tend to repeat themselves. I represent Las Vegas, so you can imagine how important travel and tourism are to us. We have in my district also McCarran Airport, and although it's not the hub of any airline, it's the 7th busiest airport in the country. I see a lot of Spirit Airlines there, as a matter of fact, any weekend when I'm home. We had almost 50 million visitors through McCarran last year, so we're experiencing a lot of growth. We're at 85 to 90% capacity. We've got new resorts coming online. We've got new direct flights internationally, and God forbid we got the Raiders coming. So it's going to be a lot going on in my district. PFCs have really been critical to the expansion of McCarran. They helped build the new terminal. They built the airport connector tunnel. We really depend on them, and because now we're using them to pay off the bonds. I co-chair the Travel and Tourism Caucus, and I would say that I don't want to do anything that's going to hurt tourism because it's such a key to our economy. So I wanted to ask you, Ms. Barnes, we know what people don't like in an airport. Often they have these lists of airports around the world. Seldom do U.S. airports make the list of good experience airports. In some of your polling or some of your research, do you know what people do like about airports that can be funded with PFCs to make that travel experience better?
Well, we know, especially to the international traveler, how critical it is what their experience is when they land in the United States. And we know that when international travelers come to the U.S., they shop in our stores, they visit an attraction, they stay at a hotel, that's actually an export. International travelers spend on average $4,000 per visit. $7,000 is what Chinese travelers spend on average. So encouraging those folks to come and to continue to come to our airports is critical. To your point, not one of the U.S. airports is in the top 25 airports in the world. And we've got the needs of, I think, 65% of infrastructure needs are actually needed within the 30 hubs where the international travelers arrive. So it's really critical because when international travelers come here, they go home, they talk to their family about their experience, and if they have an unwelcome experience that is, crowded, line, lines and delays and issues with infrastructure, then that's going to discourage them from continuing to come back and spend that money here in the U.S. So we know that they like upgrades. We know that they don't want to wait in lines and that they want to have a welcome experience.
Anybody else comment? Yes, sir?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yeah, the project that I referenced earlier, which was the project for International Airside F, which allowed us to bring in competitors and was rejected by the airlines, we were able to fund it with PFCs. And we have a brand-new international arrivals area that is spectacular. People can move through it very, very easily, and the passengers really, really appreciate it. And we're seeing record load factors on our carriers because the PFC allowed us to create a customs area that's actually proper, that you can be proud of as an American.
You know, we've seen, I think it's the American Society of Civil Engineers who rates our infrastructure. We always get a bad grade on that, but they say we're missing $45 billion in terms of just catch-up in our airports around the country. The airlines say that they've spent $115 billion since 2010. I've seen some of that going into the cabin of the aircraft, into mobile technology. Those of you who represent airports, how much do the airlines really spend on the airports?
Thank you, Representative Titus. I am not aware, as a smaller airport, small hub airport, of any joint ventures or proposals from airlines to share significant expenses of capital projects with the airport operators.
Ma'am, in the last almost 10 years that I've been at CVG, the airlines have invested almost $0 in capital improvements at my airport. As a matter of fact, it's sort of been a disinvestment. They've moved assets elsewhere.
How about Tampa?
We have, over the last 5 years, we have had airlines invest in our main terminal expansion program. So of the $1 billion project, about $100 million was the main terminal expansion. That was funded by the airlines.
Okay, so either very little or nothing. Is that right? Is that the case?
Pretty much.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Turn to Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the witnesses, and you know, I'm glad a few of our colleagues ago, Mr. Massie, mentioned that there's usually 3 sides to every story, and it's pretty clear that the airports and the representatives here today favor an increase in the PFCs. It's pretty clear that the airlines don't. My question is, you know, how do we come up with the principal compromise? I'm afraid both sides are going to get dug in, that we're not going to be able to move this issue forward at all. We all want airport improvements. Frankly, as Mr. Massie said, you know, some delays I've had, I'd like an amusement park at one of our local regional airports. I don't think that's going to happen, but it might pass the time well. But as we look ahead, we want to improve airports. We want to have more airlines serving our regional airports. We want to have more competition within the airline industry. We all have the same goals. How do we get there? So, Ms. Barnes, since you were kind of separated out by my colleague, Mr. Massie, earlier to answer a question, since you represent many of our fellow air travelers, what would you say would be the best compromise in this situation?
We think that, you know, it's really important to increase the PFC and index it to inflation. I know that doesn't sound like a compromise, but the fact is that the PFC hasn't been raised in over 19 years, and that's just not enough. I think that the chairman mentioned that would be about $2 today, and quite frankly, in a lot of the survey results that in all of the survey results that we've seen, the increase in the PFC really isn't a negative impact to the view of travelers. What travelers want is to have an increased, a better travel experience. They want less delays, they want less cancellations, and they just want a better overall environment. So We think that anyone who's flown in, for example, to 35X at DCA knows that is a terrible flight, a terrible gate to fly.
As one who flew into it yesterday, I'm well aware.
But increasing the PFC, for example, at $4.50 would take 30 years to repay the work that needs to happen at that gate. Financing would be a total cost of about 50%. Increasing the PFC to $8.50 would only take 11 years to repay. The financing would be 26%, and that saves $132 million. And that's $132 million that can be used for further investment. So we really think that is the benefit to the traveler. So I'm all for compromise, but I think in this particular instance, because we haven't seen an increase in the PFC in 19 years, and to the point on security and all of the things that our country is seeing now, the PFC increase is critical.
Well, I appreciate your viewpoint. I was hoping for something a little more than just one side with the compromise. Ma'am, go ahead.
Well, if I may, sir, we're not asking to increase the PFC to 850. What we're saying is giving the airports the ability to do that if there are projects that merit an increase. And when you identify those projects, there is a consultation process by which you have to sit down with the carriers and go through those projects. They currently even have the ability to object to the FAA if they object to any of those particular projects. So we're not saying to increase the cap to 850. We're saying give the airports the ability to do that, and there is a dialogue that does occur with the carriers over that process.
Well, thank you. And you know, I agree with both sides on this issue, which is why it's frustrating to me as a policymaker that we can't find that sweet spot. And I think we missed a golden opportunity with last year's FAA reauthorization to do so. There were some other major proposals in that bill that I think could have been, utilized to come up and find that sweet spot. I got a few seconds left. Anybody else have any comments? Yes, sir.
Thank you. I think the compromise actually starts with the bill that Chairman DeFazio and Representative Massie introduced last year. What that would have done would have eliminated that cap, but it also would have required airports going over $4.50 in a PFC to return 100% of their AIP funding. And then it would have proportionally reduced AIP spending authorization by $400 million a year. I think that is a compromise, and that's why you had a lot of fiscally conservative organizations supporting that, along with airports and those who wish to see a PFC increase.
Well, thank you. I'm out of time. I yield nothing back.
Oh, Rodney, you had 2 seconds. Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad to follow my colleague. I think he stated it best. I agree with both sides. It's a bit of a dilemma to be in this position. But, as the committee has noted, more than, $1 billion passengers implaned at U.S. airports on domestic and foreign carriers in 2018. The Federal Aviation Administration anticipates this number will increase. Passenger enplanements on U.S. carriers alone are expected to rise 1 billion annually by 2028 and to 1.3 billion by 2038. U.S. airports have estimated total of $128 billion in infrastructure needs to keep up with the current demand and plan for expected passenger growth between 2019 and 2023. This need outweighs the current projected federal spending for airport improvement projects. Passenger facility charges, or PFCs, are not the only source of airport infrastructure funding, nor were they created for that purpose. Airports' largest source of revenue comes from fees that they control. Landing fees, airline changes, and revenue from concessions, parking, rental, car rentals, and other services. And raising these fees could be done easily without an act of Congress. So finally, here's my question. Why is there such a focus on increasing PFCs, can airports find other ways to raise revenue and that will limit the financial impact on the most important participant in this whole system, and that's the passenger? Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Congressman. We do have the ability, I mean, the airports are basically run by user fees. Landing fee is a user fee, so when you land on a runway, we charge you a certain amount. A parking fee is a user fee because you used concrete overnight and you stored your car. So we set those fees. The passenger facility charge is a fee on passengers who use our facilities, and it's paid by all passengers. We want the people who fly in from Cleveland and the people from Chicago and the people from New York who fly into Tampa to pay their fair share. If I raise the parking rate, then only the people in Tampa are paying for that. I think it's incumbent on the passengers who use the facility to pay their fair share. And that's why I think the increase in the PFC is right.
Anyone else?
Representative Payne, I would just echo what Mr. Lopano said. It surprises people sometimes when we talk about how our airports earn revenue. And in Spokane, which I think is representative of many small airports, airline fees only amount to about 30%. So we are already out there maximizing all of the non-airline or non-aeronautical revenues that we possibly can. And the reason for that is to keep costs lower to the airline partners. So we really work hard to maximize those non-airline revenues. And I would also say, as Mr. Lopano pointed out, is that the PFC is a very elegant fiscal sustainability mechanism because it divides the cost of running the facility across those who use it and not just limits it to, for instance, the taxpayers of a certain municipality that may be the sponsor of the airport. So in Spokane, our market area is very large, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. 2 provinces of Canada, several states, probably over 1.3 million people. So it would be disproportional for the taxpayers of Spokane County or the city of Spokane to pay the entire costs associated with the capital program of Spokane International Airport when it serves a large area like that and that many people.
Okay. No, thank you, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank gentleman, Mr. Kako.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, for this hearing today. I think it's very important. Air travel is going to be increasing 30 to 40% in the not-too-distant future. And on top of the current infrastructure needs we have, there's a conversation that we must have. Mr. Lopano, you said something that we really haven't talked much about today, and I want to concentrate on it a little bit because it's an important component of the airport's futures, and that is security and anti-terrorism measures. I led a congressional delegation to Europe, and we stood in the very spot in the Brussels airport where the terrorists brought in bags and detonated them and killed all those people. And the non-secure area of airports is a huge vulnerability for all airports. And that's an infrastructure concern as well as an anti-terrorism measure. And getting the throughput from the non-secure side to the secure side is critically important. That's why anytime I see long lines at TSA, and I was a TSA subcommittee chair for 4 years, so I saw it, all the problems, and in Chicago a few years ago, for example. So getting that throughput is very important. And also considering the fact that in the terrorism realm, the technological advancements by the bad guys are frightening. When you have a bomb the size of a cell phone can take down an airplane, you need to have the technology at the airports and ready wherewithal to find that needle in the haystack. And quite frankly, we're way behind. And one of the things we did was TSA is going to the next generation of scanners, which are 3D scanners. We need them now. We needed them last year. And right now, the machines are about $300,000 a machine. We need 2,500 machines to tune about $750 million for the machine itself, not to mention all the infrastructure improvements that need to go along with these new machines. And also, the bin returns that speed up the process as well is important. These machines would allow the screener to only look at a bag when the machine alerts to the bag. So in other words, it's a lot quicker throughput with bags, which is a very good thing. So that's an area that we're not talking about, but I know that Mr. Lopano, I think, said that the PFCs are or were intended to fund security side measures. So I just want to hear from you folks as to what other attendant costs are there, not just with upgrading to the 3D scanners, which we have to have now, and we got to figure a way to fund them now, but also everything else that goes along with it.
Yes, Congressman. We are, when the law was introduced, one of the main tenets of the law was to improve security. It was also about environmental and competition, but security was part of it. And that was long before 9/11. It was adjusted in the year before 9/11 up to 450, and it hasn't been touched since. And I think your point is perfect. We are far behind others around the world in the ways that they use security, in the ways that they use their bin devices, and how you can get through security so much easier. It's almost an embarrassment when you think about it.
I just want to interrupt one second, because when we were in Brussels, and this is where the whole thing started with me, this is when I really got on it. There was 3D scanners there, this was several years ago now, and automatic bin returns and everything.
Mm-hmm.
They're American made.
Yeah.
And
Well,
we are so far behind with that, so you're absolutely right, so please go ahead.
That's what happens when you don't touch a fee for 20 years. You end up with not having the money to do the things that you really know are right. A lot of people really know what to do, we just don't have the money. That's why we come here and testify before you. That doesn't even mention the cybersecurity. We get hit every day with thousands of tries to penetrate our system. And if you take down an airport system, one or two airport systems, you've taken down the whole aviation in the country. And so these are things that we have to really focus on. They're things that we didn't envision, but we now know they're true, so let's raise the PFC to help us become more secure.
So if I hear correctly, you're saying it's not just the bricks and mortars we're talking about here, we're talking about the security component. And I'm the ranking member on that Homeland Security, Cyber Security now, Cyber Committee, and it's frightening, the attacks that are happening every day, and the attempted attacks, and the vulnerabilities that we have. And cyber hygiene is a critical importance that is not cheap, but it has to be done at the airports, and it has to be done now. So anybody else want to add to that?
Well, if I may, the newest portion of our airport is our security screening building. It was built in 2000. It was built at a time when we had 90% connecting traffic. So as you can imagine, since our local passengers are now about 90% of our mix, it is woefully undersized. There are very long lines. That is one of our projects that we'd like to do and move it up more quickly in the queue, is to increase just the size of the brick and mortar. And to your point, our bag system, again, I referenced, was outdated. It does not accommodate the new screening mechanisms that, even if they were provided to us, even if we could secure them, they do not fit with our existing infrastructure. We have to be able to fund those in some way, and the PFC increase would allow us to do that more quickly.
I believe I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. If anybody else has any input on this, I'd appreciate you just providing it in writing to us, because it's important that I hear about this. Thank you.
Well, I just want to say that was an excellent, and you made an excellent point, which is there's two sides. The Fed should be paying for the machines. The airports have to pay to accommodate the machines. And Congress, in its wisdom, is diverting, as you know, we're charging passengers money for security that's being diverted who knows where outside. And I believe you're a co-sponsor on the FASTER Act to spend that money on security.
You're exactly right, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, we'd move to Representative Stanton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. This is a very important hearing. I appreciate the testimony of all of the witnesses here today. Before joining this committee, before joining Congress, I was mayor of Phoenix, Arizona. So we had to run Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, one of the largest airports in America, almost 45 million passengers each year and growing. I represent one of the fastest growing communities in the United States of America. We did utilize the passenger facility charge in very responsible ways, including adding 15 new gates to Terminal 3 at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, which we recently named after Senator John McCain and honored him and his service to country. We did fund a people mover system that will take thousands and thousands of cars away from the airport and make it the passenger experience so much more efficient and pleasant to be able to come to and from the airport by getting those buses and cars off the road, and allow the people mover system to deliver thousands of people each day to our car rental facility. In the past, we've used the PFC for runway security improvements, community noise reduction program, and yet, despite the proper use of that, we're not keeping up with demand. We're not even keeping up close to demand. We've got 1.75 million in infrastructure needs just at that airport. I also represent portions of the city of Mesa now, and Phoenix Mesa Gateway Airport also saw a record year for passengers as well, and they are just growing leaps and bounds, and they need the support. I can also tell you that ideas that we would use general obligation bonds of a city at the airport is not realistic. We're a very efficiently run city, just like the cities that are represented here at the table and those airports. We use those resources for police and fire and parks and libraries and other needs of the community, and they're bursting at the seams as well. So realistically, the citizens of my community expect that aviation projects and infrastructure projects at airports are going to be funded at the airport and through fees at the airport. And I was struck during the initial testimony about the seemingly difference between Ms. Barnes, the representative of U.S. Travel Association, and Mr. Christie, the CEO of Spirit Airlines, about whether or not looking at this PFC and increasing the cap, giving the opportunity for local airports or local governments to make their own decision about whether to raise them or not, whether that would result in an increase in air travel or a decrease in air travel. It seemed like there was a polite disagreement, and I want to understand the difference, and Mr. Christie in particular. I don't know if that was just under the unique model of Spirit Airlines, or are you disagreeing with Ms. Barnes that this would result in an overall decrease in travel in domestic airlines?
Thank you, Congressman. I would say specifically as it relates to the Spirit model, our customers are very price sensitive. We are the lowest fare in the marketplace, and so a fixed fee increase on a per passenger basis is in a lot of ways quite regressive on those types of customers. And so we can say that it would be regressive and probably destimulative to the model for Spirit.
So therefore, you're not disagreeing, I guess, with Ms. Barnes, who's making the case that given this option to cities and airports around the country to utilize this money for infrastructure spending, important infrastructure spending across the country, would result in an overall increase in air travel in America.
Well, I don't have any data one way or the other. All I can tell you is that the current financing structure to use either public debt, taxable or non-taxable, and finance that debt with rates and charges on the airlines tends to favor efficiency. And in our case, because we're a more efficient carrier, we can defray that expense better.
Thank you. Please, Ms. Barnes.
Congressman, we know that airline fees are the top travel frustration based on survey results that we have done, and the government fees are ranked second to last, and only 2% of travelers said that a $17 PFC would be a top frustration. To do the math on the bag fee, for example, from Spirit Airlines, the gentleman noted that it would be $64 round trip for a family of four for a PFC, but quite frankly, at even $26 checked bag fee for a family of four, that's $104. Using the numbers that Mr. Massie used, it would be over $200 in checked bag fees and or carry-on bag fees. So, based on the research and the data that we have from travelers, we don't believe that a $4 increase per passenger will negatively impact the travel experience. And quite frankly, we are seeing that 10% of folks don't travel as a result of cancellations, delays, and frustrations, and we think that's another $24 billion of spend that could go back into the economy if those folks decided to take their trips.
I think the larger question is, what's the reasonable alternative? I can only tell you an airport like Sky Harbor in a fast-growing city like Phoenix and the Phoenix metropolitan region, it is the #1 economic engine for the entire region. The more we can use that PFC to increase gates, that's great for the local and national economy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, with that, Representative Babin.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Mr. Christie, I have a little different perspective on the PFC. I want to thank you and all your fellow folks sitting down there as witnesses. Appreciate you being here. I want to ask you about the passenger facility charge. In my district, which is Texas 36, almost everyone in my 9-county district uses either Houston Bush or Houston Hobby Airport as their primary airport. But the governing board for those airports is mostly controlled by the elected and accountable only to Harris County and Houston voters. And while those in our other 8 counties are not technically Houstonians, they and others from the surrounding counties make up a huge share of the passenger volume and revenue as well at these airports every day. And I'm one of them because I don't live in Harris County in my district. This is about protecting the hardworking taxpayer. And so how is that not taxation without representation for a local government to have complete authority over the collection and use of the PFC fee revenue when their actions affect the pocketbooks of the entire region that relies on these airports? And I understand it's been in effect for years, but here we're essentially thinking about doubling this tax. So what can be done to ensure that these decisions are made with the input and consent of all of the folks in that region, not just one county or city where that airport happens to be located? Can you give me your perspective on that?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. Yes, you know, the PFCs, while there are positive uses for the PFCs, and again, as I stated early on, airport infrastructure is important, and the construction around that is an important issue that we all solve for. But what needs to be done is to make sure that the burden borne by that airport infrastructure work is done fairly and in accordance with what you would expect for the people who are traveling through that airport. And we think that rates and charges do that more efficiently and actually do it in a way that probably is more akin to what you're alluding to, which is use. Those people using the facilities are the ones who actually pay for it.
Yeah, okay. And if anyone else out there on the panel would like to chime in, I would sure appreciate it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. First, I would say the PFC isn't a tax, and it meets all the criteria that establish it as a user fee. The fact that the only people who are paying it are those using those airport facilities, and then those dollars raised from them are going back to benefit those facilities. It's a classic example of a user fee. So I don't like calling it a tax, but I think really what we should be getting at is what the PFC cap is, and I think it's an arbitrary government price control. Here we have Congress that since 2000 has left it in place, not allowing local communities and specifically local airports to make their own investment decisions, and that has driven, academic research has found that this is a problem, and this is driving airport inefficiencies across the country. So if we want to see our airports be more efficient like they are in other countries, we've got to get these arbitrary federal restrictions out of the way.
Thank you. It's Mr. Scribner, right?
Correct.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that slant that you have on that, your ideas. Anybody else want to?
Well, sir, if I may, also
ma'am.
relative to having input in PFC projects, once an airport develops its list of PFC projects, it takes it to its local board. Those are open public meetings. Anybody can attend. It's submitted to the FAA, has to meet its list of published criteria. The FAA reviews that, and there is a local consultation process with carriers. So it's a wide range of consultations with respect to imposition of that user fee.
Okay, thank you very much. I guess I'll yield back, no, unless somebody else has some perspective on that. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, Mr. Allred.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for coming up to D.C. and taking the time out. I read your written testimonies and really appreciate it. You know, there's a tension here between increasing the cap for PFCs and our needed investments in our airports, which those of us who are on this committee see in every area of infrastructure now. You know, we need to combat congestion. We need to invest in the future. Somebody's going to have to pay for it. How are we going to do that? You know, that's the kind of tension that we're facing here. And you know, we have a couple of great airports that service my district in Dallas, and North Dallas and North Texas, DFW and Love Field. Great airports. Great also airlines at those airports, American and Love, that have done incredible things for our community. So I'm, like a lot of my colleagues here, you know, we're having a hard time, I think, trying to figure out what's the right balance. But Dallas has also become a tourist attraction, and I'm really proud of that. And I want us to continue to be an attraction, Ms. Barnes. And I know I've met with some of your folks, and I think we're doing well there. In 2017, 27 million people visited Dallas, spending $4.7 billion and generating a total economic impact of $8 billion for us. And it also supports tourism, supports 61,000 jobs, and brings millions of dollars to our local revenue. And so I want to talk about future demands, because I'm hoping that our travelers increase to Dallas, that we get more. In your testimony, your written testimony, you talk about what might happen if we don't keep up with the demands and how that might impact our travel. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more and what you see from your industry side, the impact of us not investing and being ready for this increase in travel.
Sure, thank you. And our folks really enjoyed spending time with you down in your district recently. We're seeing that there are 32 million trips that are avoided due to airport hassles each year. And what we think that will look like is that, by 2021, the top 30 airports will experience Thanksgiving-like congestion 1 day per week. And by 2030, there will be at least 9 airports that will not have enough airside capacity to meet demand. And so, that's the reason that we support an increase in the PFC, again, an optional increase for airports to use at their discretion and with FAA approval, because as I noted when Congresswoman Titus mentioned the importance of international travelers coming to the U.S., we want to encourage more international travelers to come here, to spend their money here at places, at restaurants and attractions and hotels. And that's an export, and that's a benefit to the economy. So we think that increases in infrastructure. We know that there's about 32 million, as I said, folks not taking trips. That's $24 billion. So that's not happening in the economy. And we think that those folks will go ahead and take a trip if we see these improvements, if we see shorter wait times and better security and other strengthened opportunities. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, when we talk about the top 30 hubs, I mean, DFW is the 4th largest, so we would be one of those. I am a big believer in competition, and I want to find the right ways to increase competition. Mr. Crowder, though, you mentioned in your written testimony there's been a shift in airport infrastructure that we need to be looking at from airside to landside facilities. Dallas Love, which serves my district, as I said, has only one entry from a heavily used city street. The intersection at the airport entrance is consistently congested, and Dallas Love is closest to where I live, so I take it a lot due to the high volume of traffic, and that's magnifying the need for an alternate entry. And I'm love to talk to you about how the PFC is more flexible for those kinds of investments.
I'm going through that right now, Congressman Allred, in Spokane. Same issue where we have congested access road, and we're trying to use AIP money to try to fund that. But we have run into so much red tape and so many roadblocks in that process, and we need to move more quickly. We need to build that road this year. And then it's also a game of diminishing returns with how you want to use that AIP money, because we're putting it on a lower priority. It's not an airfield priority, so that means we cut ourselves off from discretionary funding with the FAA. So we really have to look at the PFC as being that flexible funding source that can help us move at the speed at which we need to move in order to service this demand. And the other thing I would say, just going back to your comment about tourism really for just a second, is that we all want to see increased tourism in our communities. My community wants to go to Dallas. And the issue becomes, can we get a gate there? Right. And I think for all intents and purposes, what we're hearing more and more often from larger metro areas and from airlines is that, well, we know that there's demand, but we don't have enough gates. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a big issue in terms of your district, and I think that's, again, where the PFC comes in to allow airports the ability to build those gates to allow additional access for smaller communities.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have heard that, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Garrett Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. This has been very informative, and I appreciate all of you being here. You know, this issue is somewhat complex, and there are good arguments on both sides. On the one hand, I'm not a big fan of taxes and fees, and so I struggle a little bit with increasing it. But at the same time, as the chairman has been very vocal about watching some of the fees being raised by airlines on seats and baggage and other things, and the PFC not keeping pace, there's an argument to be made there. On the other side, watching the airlines make their own investments. And I think in the last 10 years, the airlines have made about $120 billion in investments out of their own pockets to help improve aviation infrastructure. And so that's something important to keep in mind. They're making investments where there's a return on investment. We are assured that these investments are going to provide payoffs, and these are not being funded by taxpayers. Another interesting point here is that you have, in this case, the federal government telling our local governments what they can do. And I have concerns about that and giving more local government control. And having worked in state government for an infrastructure agency, I've seen in the past where government agencies have made bad investments. They've invested dollars, I think, poorly in some cases. We haven't talked much about some of the largest revenue streams like landing fees, like concessions, car rentals. I know I've paid $4 for a bottle of water more than once, and certainly there's money to be made there. Parking, airline charges, and other revenue streams there. And I also know that we invested $1 billion in AIP supplemental funds. Mr. Get the name right. Mr. Crowder, I believe you just talked about perhaps the inefficiency or dysfunction with the AIP program. That's something that we need to work on. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Mr. Christie, a number of airports have talked about how the cost per enplanement is something that by making PFC investments, they can help to bring that down. For Spirit, where does that metric fall for you? Does that determine where you have flights, or where does that fall in your overall calculation?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, the cost per enplaned passenger is a very important component of our cost structure. As I said, is the lowest fare entry point in the marketplace. Those dollars can add up quickly for our consumer, and they are a very elastic consumer. So cost per enplanement is a very important metric, and the passenger facility charge, as I said earlier, is just an added amount on top of that cost per enplaned passenger.
Is that your primary motivation, or where you can get the lowest cost per enplanement?
No, there are a number of reasons we look to get into an airport. We're looking at prevailing demand. We're looking at opportunity. We're looking at available gate facilities. All of those are important, but the cost of operating the airport is key as well.
Thank you. Mr. Lupano, Mr. Scribner talked about how the TNCs, the transportation network companies, the Ubers, Lyfts, and others are affecting revenue for airports. One credit rating agency actually found that airports have been able to stabilize the revenue as a result, their income as a result of some of the changes that TNC's entries into the market and the change that they've caused. What are you seeing at your airport? Are you seeing revenues go down? Have you been able to stabilize? What have y'all done at Tampa?
Yeah, it has affected our parking revenues, and we were able to enact a fee to use the roadways to pick up passengers. And that fee has generated some money back to the airport, but not enough to offset the loss in parking. But I think your point is a really good one, is that our revenue streams are changing. Our revenue streams are being challenged. And the PFC has always been a reliable source of revenue for us. And this is not one that we can afford to let become weakened by inflation. It's one that we should try to strengthen.
Thank you. Last question, Mr. Christie. Recently met with one of the other airlines who indicated that they'd recently invested $3 billion of their own money in a terminal at one of the airports. How do you decide, as an airline, how do you decide where to make those investments? What motivates your strategy?
Well, there's going to be a number of inputs. Obviously, we are a smaller airline compared to the other airlines you may be referring to. So, access to capital for us is not as routine and easy as it may be for a larger airline. But we would look to speed for those airports that are looking to add capacity, where we can partner with them and increase the speed that capacity comes online. That's definitely going to be a consideration as well.
Thank you. Yield back all 3 seconds.
Representative Garcia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to all the members of the panel who have shared their experience and wisdom. I hail from Chicago, the home of O'Hare International Airport and Midway Airport, which is near my home. Together, O'Hare being the busiest airport in the country, and together they host over 105 million passengers every year. This past week, while back in town, I convened several meetings on infrastructure to hear what people in my district are thinking and what they're hoping for in terms of infrastructure investment. One story that I heard was from a member of a trade union, the building trades in Chicago, who said he recently visited China and was quite struck by their investment in their airports system, and he was pretty disheartened by the stark contrast here at airport facilities at home. So I think that is a real shame, and more reason why we need to consider investing in airport infrastructure to address the issue of increased capacity, reduce congestion, implement technologies, and keep us safe and our systems efficient and accessible. Having said that, a couple of questions back to Mr. Scribner. In your testimony, you go into significant detail about the historical application of AIP and PFC funding at O'Hare, like other airports presently, including Memphis, LAX, and LA. There are multi-million-dollar projects underway. Chicago's about to kick off an $8.5 billion modernization program. First, can you describe to me the different types of projects that are eligible for AIP and PFC funds and where those eligibilities diverge in practice?
Right. So under the law, AIP is generally eligible for the airside projects, the taxiways, runways, aprons, land acquisition, and so forth. PFC projects are the AIP, all of those are PFC eligible, but PFC has the added bonus of allowing for more terminal projects, and that's where we see the advances. But even if we don't, say we had a question about a ground approach, ground access, a new road on airport property to the terminal. That's eligible under AIP and under PFC, but the PFC, importantly, unlike AIP, can be used in financing, can be used to service debt. That's something AIP can't do. So this flexibility, and this gets down to the fundamental benefit of the PFC over AIP, it's more flexible. It allows for different types of funding and financing options that AIP just can't have. And that means that you're going to see more efficient airport investment and resulting operations.
So in cases like O'Hare, where carriers argue that airports' capital needs can be met largely by private investment, are there types of projects that only AIP or PFCs address that airline carriers may inadvertently neglect or lack the incentives to robustly fund?
So I think this gets at a long-term debate between airports and airlines. From either perspective, the airlines are going to want to maximize their control over airport decisions, and airports are going to want to minimize any airline involvement in those decision-making, and then you have all these types of practices in between. But as we've seen, with beginning in the 1950s and in more recent history, when the airlines say we're going to finance something for you, they're not doing that out of the goodness of their heart. They're going to want something in return, and often what that's meant is they're going to get long-term exclusive use gate leases or preferential gate leases, and they use those to keep out lower-cost competitors, such as Spirit. And that is a problem. That raises airfares for consumers. So that's another benefit of the PFC overturning to airline customers.
Okay. Thank you. As I only have about 20 seconds, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Garcia. Representative LaMalfa, 5 minutes.
Thank you. So what we've seen is that when we talk about the gas tax around here, we see that effectively it's staying par, going down. And so what we see differently with the PFC, it's all-time high of $3.3 billion of revenue brought in. Airports have raised $30 billion, and you would see that on a basis of per passenger, that's outpaced inflation at a rate of 47%. So bottom line, that means approximately 21% of a ticket cost per passenger is already just taxes and fees, which is basically reaching sin tax level, and that kind of, to me, connotes bringing the Green New Deal into it, since that's treating airline travel as a sin with what its goals are in the New Deal. So why is it that it seems justifiable to have so much to be built into fees when passengers, again, they're having such a big burden of their ticket in these fees? And I want to bring it back home to, with all the available opportunities there is for airports, airlines to raise revenue, and it's been talked about a couple times here, but why is it we want to use congressional action to cause PFC increases instead of the available tools that they have? When Congress does it, becomes pretty, it's a higher burden to put it in place, and then to change on once it has passed when there's other more local options with more local input. They have that authority locally to raise via those other sources. Why does it have to be a congressional action? I throw that to the panel. If I may, Congressman, I think it shouldn't be in the hands of Congress. I think it should be locally controlled. We make more money in parking than we make from PFCs, but we don't have to come to Congress when we raise our parking rates. So we're pretty responsible. We know how to run these businesses, and we've been coming up here for 19 years fighting this fight. And I'd love to get local control of it because we have a board of directors that controls us. It's not like the airport director's just running around doing what he wants to do. We have a board that's appointed by our governor. So we have oversight and we have accountability.
I wanted to address the topic of other sources of the ability to raise revenue. You talk about landing fees. At most airports, the airfields are done on a residual cost basis. So whatever it takes to operate that airfield is how you set your landing fees. If airports collect an excess at the end of the year, that money is rebated to the carriers on a prorated basis on how they use that airfield. So there aren't any additional fees, there aren't any additional costs that are built in other than what's captured truly. In terms of the concession revenues you discussed, most airports now have, similar to Cincinnati, something where we work out an agreement with the carriers that if we exceed a certain revenue threshold within the terminal, that certain monies are rebated back to the carriers. So
I'm talking concessions, food, and things.
exactly,
that are, yeah,
exactly, right? So after, all of our expenses, et cetera, if we have an excess of revenue, as we have agreed with the carriers, that money is rebated to the carriers. There are limitations that are already in existence on what fees, on what user fees that we can impose upon our passengers. The TNC fees are set locally. It's driven by market condition. The parking revenues are set locally based on market condition. PFCs should be similarly set based on local market condition. We know what our markets will bear. It's Economics 101. It's worked for Adam Smith, throughout the centuries. Local control would be better served. Airports would be better served by local control with governing boards, airport directors, and local officials weighing in on it.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Congressman. Just real quick. I would say eliminating the cap or increasing the cap on the PFC wouldn't be the federal government stepping in. This would be the federal government backing out. Recall, as I said in my testimony, that the only reason the PFC exists is because it's a narrow exception to the general federal prohibition enacted in 1973 on local user fees for air travelers. So that was a decision Congress made in the 70s. The PFC is an exemption. I would like to see that exemption expanded, but it would not be Congress stepping in if it were to increase that cap or eliminate it.
Thank you.
Congressman, just one last quick word. When we're talking about increases, I just think it's important to note that the RS Means Construction Cost Index increased 84% from 2000 to 2018 as well, for context.
84% increase in.
All right,
Yes.
thank you, Larry. Just because you're from Washington State doesn't mean you get to talk over my gavel.
Yes, sir, Mr. Larson.
Representative Craig from Minnesota for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to address my question to Mr. Crowder here this morning, or I guess it is already afternoon. Thank you for bearing with us. It's been a long morning. Mr. Crowder, I come from a district in Minnesota that has access to a large metropolitan airport that flies to many regional hubs around the country. There's a misconception that the PFC is only helpful for large hub airports. Would an increase still help smaller hub airports that don't have the high traffic volumes that large hubs have? And can you discuss how the current hub and spoke system constrains regional air travel and how more gates in major hubs could help smaller communities?
Thank you, Congresswoman. The issue is how much smaller airports right now depend on the PFC, and for a number of different reasons. One is that net operating revenues, cash flows are usually fairly low at smaller airports. It doesn't really support that much in what we call non-grant funded capital programs. As a result, smaller airports tend to have a significant reliance on airport improvement program funding, in which we've talked about that, is that because it's been flat and because of inflation, it doesn't buy as much. And the other issue is that most airports our size are at the 450 PFC for a reason. It's because they need that capacity. So going back to the reliance on that is that in order for them to provide that infrastructure for their community, on the reverse side, there's got to be PFC capacity for those larger airports, as I talked with Mr. Allred about, in terms of your access into the national air transportation system. And as we talk about, it's economic development for your community as well, because what people don't focus on enough is how important it is to be able to get people from out in the world to your community, ideally with one stop. Because if you can do that, you can unlock the economic development potential of your community so much more, especially in this global economy. So I think that access is critical, and it's just not access at the small airports, it's access for smaller communities at the larger connecting airports.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Mcgraw, I wanted to just direct the next one to you. One of the statutory uses for PFCs is for capacity projects to increase competition, unlike the AIP program. Can you tell us a little bit how the PFC has enabled airports to attract more service and provide customers more options, lower fares, et cetera?
As I mentioned, we've been able to grow our passenger base, our local passenger base, 97%, and increase competition. We were able to do that because we used PFCs to renovate certain gates that had been sitting dormant. When we were able to do that, our other carriers, other than our dominant carrier at the time, were able to expand and increase. Therefore, greater competition, lowering airfares, $255 per ticket.
Thank you so much. And then I'll finish out with Mr. Christie. Spirit Airlines is increasing competition in regions around the country. That's great, as Spirit seeks to continue expanding and creating new hub and spoke pathways. Would the PFC be helpful in your company's effort to serve more small communities?
Thank you, Congressman. No, our view is that that the PFC is actually, as I mentioned earlier, a bit regressive in our model. Our fares are at the absolute lowest in the industry, and so the PFC in some ways artificially shifts the burden to low fare paying customers. What probably is more efficient is a broader discussion around competition at broader airports and what's happened with consolidation and the use of the facilities at that airports, which is something that's much deeper than just a discussion around a PFC.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you. I now call on Mr. Mitchell of Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quick question for anybody that could answer it from the airports. What was the interest rate on the last tranche of municipal bonds you issued for development? Anybody have an answer to that?
It's about 3 to 5.5%.
Well, it can't be 3 to 5.5. What was it, sir?
Different maturities have different rates.
Most recent issuance was what, 3%?
It went from 3 to 5.5%, depending on maturities.
Okay. I don't think I got the detail I'd like. I'd like all of you to provide for the record the maturities, the interest rates of various maturities of bonds you have, please. I'd like to see it if we could. I want to go back to the $128 billion in airport capital figures, the needs that have been detailed, and unpack that math for a bit because I think it's important. Let me start by saying the Airports Council International indicates that 10% of that need is at one airport, LAX. More than a third of that need is at only 10 airports. Yet we want to uncap the PFC or increase it substantially, depending on your perspective, across the country. My concern is we're also talking about it as $128 billion in a 5-year period. Now, frankly, I don't think you can build $128 billion in 5 years, but we're also talking about financing it in 5 years. Now, do any of you have your homes financed in 5 years? Are any of your maturities in 5 years? The answer to both of those we know is not. But it does create the gap you're seeking to demonstrate that you need more in the PFC. Airports have talked about lowering interest payments by increasing the PFC, but clearly there's not an unmet need. I've asked multiple airports, including mine, Detroit Metro, to tell me one thing they can't do because they can't access private capital, and they did not have a response for the question. Yeah, we want to uncap this. It's a hidden tax. You can call it a user fee. We can call it a tax. I'm an economist. We can debate it as long as you want, sir. My question is, what metrics should Congress use to determine whether airport funding is insufficient besides simply saying we need more? Because I just left the House Armed Services Committee, and that's a discussion over there, too, pretty predominant around here. Anybody have any good answer for that other than saying it hasn't been increased?
Congressman, I gave an example earlier where we had a number of international airlines who wanted to fly to Tampa, and we wanted to accommodate them, and it would have been a north of $25 million project. So according to our airline agreement, we have to ask the airlines if they're willing to pay for that or if they're willing to approve that. And they said, no, we don't want that competition. And so that's a project that wouldn't have gotten done had we not accessed PFCs to use to lower that amount so that the airlines would have to approve it.
Exactly my point, though. You did access the PFC. You were able to build it. You weren't able to finance it. You weren't limited by lack of PFC. In fact, there's $7 billion in the airline trust fund, right? The airport trust fund now. So you've indicated my exact point, which is, now I'll make one other point for Mr. Lopano. You made an excellent point earlier, and I agree with you. You make more money, you get more revenue, let me put it that way, from your parking rate fees than you do from the PFC.
Correct.
I agree wholeheartedly. Local control. So what do you say we eliminate the PFC and airports raise the funds they need to raise to whatever mechanisms they have, parking fees. Some people have fees on accessing the airport, concession fees. If you want local control, why don't we do that?
Those are options. What I'm advocating for here today is increasing the PFC because it is one of the tools that we've had for 20 years and has allowed us to grow the airports that we have and grown to the levels that we see today.
Well, because we've done something for 20 years doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. We should continue it or expand it.
Well, it's been eaten up by inflation, and it hasn't been adjusted, so it has less power, less ability for us to build.
Well, with $7 billion sitting in the trust fund, I'm not sure there was the right number to begin with, so to say it was based on our original base number, and that was the number, I mean, and therefore we should get more, which is the argument, sir. So help me understand, there's $7 billion in the airport trust fund. You indicated you built out for international additional gates at $25 million, and were able to do that. Were you delayed in doing it? Were you unable to accomplish that?
You want to talk about trust?
I guess the answer is no. My point is that I support airport development. I think you should pay for it by telling people when they come in the door what it's going to cost them rather than hiding it in airline fees. And that is hidden. If we went in an airport and asked anybody what their PFC was, if they knew what it was, they'd look at you like you'd lost your mind. Let's be transparent with folks. And I exceeded my time, and I apologize, Mr. Chair, but thank you very much.
We actually had 3 seconds left, Mr. Mitchell. You can't have it back. Representative Malinowski from New Jersey.
Thank you. Just to follow on that, parking fees have gone up in the last 20 years, correct? I seem to have noticed that in my travel. Right, so there are other options, but they have actually been employed, whereas the PFC has been capped all this time. So I think that's an important difference. Mr. Christie, let me ask you a few questions. You said in your testimony that you're concerned that increasing the PFC by $4 could lead to a decrease in travel because demand is elastic. Well, I went online last night to see if I could book a ticket on Spirit from Newark to Orlando, because, you know, I've heard the weather's pretty good down there.
Should head down.
And the price of the ticket was around $170, which is pretty good for the day before travel. But then there were the add-ons, and we've talked a little bit about this already. $30 for the first check bag, $35 to bring a carry-on on the flight, and I've never flown in my entire life for business, pleasure, family without bringing a carry-on. And so let me just ask you this directly. Do you think that a $35 carry-on fee decreases flight use more or less than an extra $4 would? I mean, address the price elasticity point with respect to all of these fees.
Thank you, Congressman. I think it's a great point. The point is that our model is designed in an unbundled manner, which is different than what other airlines may use, but the total cost of that travel is still considerably less than what you would pay on other airlines. So even with a very low fare and a bag and a seat, you're still going to pay 30% less than you'll pay on other airlines. That's the stimulative effect of our model. And each additional amount that is not related to the model itself is going to destimulate that model over time. Each additional dollar of taxes or fees would naturally have the impact on destimulation.
Well, it's not just low-cost airlines these days. I think you may be driving this this trend. You know, United is charging now to use the overhead bin if you're in so-called basic economy. And I got to say, I speak to folks who I represent and have some sense of what they're angry and frustrated about in life. And I've heard quite a bit about not just the added cost in their minds of these fees, but something that is maybe less tangible but even more powerful, the indignity of a world in which we are constantly dividing and subdividing our fellow Americans into different classes, better or worse. The idea that we have to pay extra for even the most basic things, not just in airline travel, but certainly in the case of airline travel, when, as another member mentioned, if you're a family of four, these things adding up, the cost, the indignity, that is a complaint I've heard again and again and again. I think it does depress airline travel. I've never once heard anybody complain about a small user fee at an airport. And yes, people do know. I look at my ticket and I know that they're adding these things, and I ask if we know that it's dedicated to improving airport facilities and security. So my experience in life, I have to disagree with your assessment.
Well, as I said earlier, we treat every customer the same. There are no, every customer has the option to buy the services that we offer. In fact, it may not be clear, but we do offer a bundled service as well for those people who want to make sure that everything's included up front. But we think that's a very democratic approach to travel, is people pick and choose what's important to them. That's what drives low prices and stimulation. And we think that's an important part of the model, actually. And our entry into new markets does stimulate more and more travel.
Well, that said, I don't believe that most Americans feel like we're all being treated the same by our airlines. Thank you. I yield back.
You're welcome. Thank you. I'll turn now to Representative Balderson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. My first question is directed to Mrs. Barnes. Thank you for being here and for this important testimony. You mentioned that the airport hassles cost Americans to avoid 32 million trips in 2017, costing the U.S. economy more than $24 billion. I think I can say with confidence that my friends on this committee and I fully understand and appreciate many of those frustrations. Aside from issues that are beyond the control of airports and airlines, such as weather delays, what do you believe are the most inconvenient hassles and problems Americans experience when flying?
Thank you, Congressman. Based on surveys of travelers that we recently conducted, we found that the top 3 frustrations of travelers are, number 1, airline fees, number 2, the overall cost of traveling, and number 3, airport hassles. And flight delays are also at the top, but those are the top 3 reasons that folks are frustrated.
follow-up to that, thank you for your answer. Have you seen any specific examples in recent years of airlines or airports changing policies to promote more customer-friendly approach to flying? And Mr. Christie, you may feel free to also answer.
We do see that when folks are less frustrated, that they do increase travel. I think I noted in my testimony that there are 32 million trips that are avoided due to airport hassles. That's travelers avoiding 2 to 3 trips per year. But when they do feel a welcome environment, when there are there shorter lines, when there's a better travel experience, when there's a better facilitation, that folks do travel more and they travel more frequently. I think that it's 9 airports won't have enough airside capacity to meet demand by 2030, and the top 30 airports will experience Thanksgiving-like congestion 1 day per week. Those are just not sustainable, and those don't make folks want to fly. So that's one of the reasons that our members support an increase in the PFC to help better the environment and ensure that travelers have the experience that they need.
Thank you, Congressman. I think as Ms. Barnes mentioned, one of the things that frustrates travelers the most is the cost of travel. And in that respect, Spirit and its model is designed to address that very concern. And while it's easy to make generalizations about people who travel on airplanes, the truth of the matter is the vast majority of people on Spirit are low or middle income individuals who have not had the opportunity to travel before, and our low fares and the ability for them to customize their travel stimulates that activity. And so in that respect, I think we've been directly addressing the issues that the consumers are complaining about.
Thank you for your answers. My last question is for Ms. Mcgraw and Mr. Krotner. Good to see you again, sir. I appreciate the need for the committee to discuss the PFC and the AIP. However, while we have you, I also want to touch on the status of the development and implementation of safety and technology updates for our runways and taxiways. I've heard concerns from air traffic controllers at the John Glenn Columbus International Airport that they still do not have access to ASDE X technology, posing potential safety risk on the runways. As we discuss why investment in our airports and aviation is so urgent, can you discuss the needs of your respective airports as it relates to safety and emergency equipment?
Thank you, Representative Balderson. Good to see you again, too, sir. We share the same concerns with those controllers, particularly in the small airport environment where the cost of an ASDE system is estimated at something like $40 million. And if you look at some of the statements that were made earlier, I think by Mr. Mitchell, that there's a surplus in the Aviation Trust Fund, I think what's instructive is that the Aviation Trust Fund is used to fund a number of different accounts, not just the Airport Improvement Program, but also facilities and equipment. Very, very important part of the FAA budget, and that even at $7 billion a year, that's only about 5 months of FAA operating authority based on their most recently approved fiscal year budget. And so it's really not a lot of financial resources, and I think that's what the controllers are basically signaling to you. In airports our size, we've looked at a number of potentially low-cost surveillance systems, but that program was actually discontinued by the FAA, and we were very disappointed not to see another generation of that coming up through the FAA. So we share that concern with those controllers.
Mrs. Mcgraw, I will put you on hold because the chairman has someone from Washington that left Ohio to go to Washington, so I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for your indulgence, Representative Balderson. Appreciate that. Representative Carbajal from California, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of you for being here today. Ms. Barnes, in your testimony, you mentioned a recent U.S. travel survey which found that airport hassles caused Americans to avoid 32 million trips and cost travel businesses $24 billion in spending, enough to support 200,000 jobs. My district includes 3 community airports and relies heavily on tourism. A recent visitor profile survey found that tourism injects $1.9 billion into Santa Barbara's economy and $1.7 billion into San Luis Obispo's economy. two questions. One, how would increasing the passenger facilities charge, PFC cap, benefit communities that rely heavily on tourism? And two, will increasing the PFC cap increase travel? And I apologize for a little bit of the redundancy here, but I always like to hear it twice.
Thank you, Congressman. We do feel that increasing the travel experience will help encourage folks to fly. We know that based on the data that you just presented, that the hindrance of 32 million trips avoided is a 10% reduction in demand. So based on economics, 10% increase would be what we would see at a minimum if we know that our infrastructure upgrades are intact. Quite frankly, for the travel and tourism industry, we know that the welcome matters. Welcoming international visitors, for example, is critical when folks come from an international space to California, in particular from Asia. International travelers, such as the Chinese, spend on average $7,000 more than the domestic traveler. We want them to keep coming back, and the better their experience is when they arrive at the airport and the less delays they have when they go home will help ensure that they come back. So I think I answered both of your questions in there, but we think the travel experience is very important, and it absolutely will help increase demand to increase the PFC and ensure the infrastructure needs are intact to continue to improve the experience.
Thank you very much. Mr. Crowder, in your testimony, you mentioned the Airport Improvement Program, AIP. You recommended that Congress increase the funding for this program to allow smaller airports to pay for necessary upgrades. Why is there still a need then to increase the passenger facility charge, PFC? And two, what are some of the airport needs that are not being met by the AIP grant program?
Let me talk about that in reverse, Congressman, if I can. First talk about the needs that aren't being met, because that is a significant impediment for the use of AIP versus PFC funds. As AIP funds, as we've talked about, tend to be prioritized by the FAA towards airfield projects. So those are the runways and taxiway projects, apron projects. They have a much lower priority ranking for terminal buildings. And right now, in our history, based on all the things we've talked about today and our tremendous growth, we have a very significant need across the country in airports of all sizes for terminal building projects. So it's counterproductive to want to move your AIP into terminal projects because the FAA doesn't reward that with additional discretionary money. They reward that when you move those AIP dollars into airfield projects. So that would be one answer. The other answer is that when you look at the stagnation of AIP, the amount of money that would have to be increased to actually make up for two things. One is inflation, and then the other is the fact that the program elements themselves, again on eligibility, are such that airports end up using PFCs to actually supplement AIP projects. And we've done that in Spokane. And as a result of either having to move more quickly or having to have more flexibility. So I hope I have answered your questions at least in two parts there. And so the last part of your question was, why do we need an increase in the PFC? And really, the reality is that those needs are so extensive at airports our size. We really depend on that PFC program, again, to supplement the lack of AIP, plus to try to fund the projects that we need. And in the case of our project, $191 million terminal project, AIP is not going to come anywhere close to being able to fund that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Representative Carbajal. Representative Palmer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Barnes, I had to step out, so some of this may have already been covered, but like my friend from California, redundancy is not a bad thing. Raising the PFC will increase competition. That's been said many times in the hearing. Other than adding more gates, are there other PFC-funded improvements that you think would improve, increase competition?
To increase competition, I mean, we think that in improving the overall experience is critical. You know, we do think competition is important, but we leave that to the airlines and the airports. We're in the mindset of the traveler and feel that the experience is important. I would note one of the issues that's come up across the board here is the security element. Without security, you cannot have travel, and having a strong security at all of our airports is really important. And Congress and Mr. Lopano noted that, and we had a robust conversation earlier. So PFCs could go to increase security upgrades at airports, and that's something outside of you know, just the building itself.
Well,
that would be
that's one of
important.
the things I want to talk to, and this is for Mr. Crowder and Ms. Mcgraw and Mr. Lopano, is that most people don't realize that TSA's responsibility for security at the airport begins at the point you go through security. Everything outside of that is local. Ticketing area, baggage claim, drop-off, pickup, all of that. And Mr. Katko and I have had this discussion. It's been going on for about 3 years now, that we've been talking about the need for local authorities to do more to provide security, whether it's, technology is great, but I'm a proponent of canine units, which just the visible presence of a canine unit is a deterrent. Is that one of the things that you foresee being done if you get the increase in the PFC?
I'll take that first, Representative Palmer. Thank you. It's a great question, and the terminal renovation and expansion project that we have planned for Spokane International Airport is all about that. The primary element of the project is a consolidated security screening checkpoint that, in part, when that is done, will make us eligible for canine teams. So I think that going back to what you've talked about with Representative Katko, we're very interested in being able to have an increase in the PFC and increase flexibility to make sure that we can fully equip these checkpoints to have the maximum capability that they need, both in processing, also in deterrence, as you point out. So the increase in the PFC is very, very important to the proper deployment of technology and other resources for that layered approach to aviation security.
I think that should be one of your main points in arguing for an increase in the passenger facility charge, because, as Ms. Barnes points out, people want to feel secure when they go there, and the incidents that Mr. Katko mentioned in Belgium, I think, could have been avoided if they had had that perimeter security. You can't guarantee that, and I don't think technology is great for detecting explosives and things like that, but it won't tell you where it went, where a dog will, and I've talked with other colleagues about the potential of using retired military dogs, and you've got retired military personnel that could be deployed, but we need to figure out a way to expand our security perimeter outside of where TSA begins. Ms. Mcgraw, Mr. Lopano, if y'all want to add anything to that.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm not the chairman, but
Oh, I'm
well,
sorry,
I am the
Mr.
chairman
Palmer.
of Republican committee, but not here, but thank you for promotion.
Well, thank you, Mr. Palmer. Our security checkpoint was built in 2000, pre-9/11. It is undersized. It's woefully inadequate to address our local passenger needs now. So one of the things we would like to do with our PFC is increase the footprint. I agree wholeheartedly with you. As my police chief constantly reminds me, you have to have a multi-layered approach to security, be it the right size facility, be it the right equipment in place, and certainly I think the canine units, we're blessed to have 3 canine units. We would love to have more. They do a lot for us relative to security. So I agree with you, and PFCs would help go for that purpose.
I think they need to be outside the building as well as inside the building, because just having them outside the building is a visible deterrent. Mr. Lopano.
Yes, Congressman, we do have, we've just acquired a specially trained dog that can smell the smell bombs from a long distance, and we deploy them outside on the curbsides. The cost of doing that, though, eats into our ability to fund capital projects, so an increase in the PFC would help ease that.
My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Palmer. Representative Johnson of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here. I know you were hoping that no other representative walked in. It's been a long morning for you, but bam, here I am. It's such an important topic that I knew I needed to be here. Airports are essential to our national infrastructure. They boast a national economic impact of $1.4 trillion and contribute roughly 7% of the U.S. GDP. They are the incubators of travel, whether domestic or abroad, business or pleasure. Passenger and cargo traffic through airport facilities continues to grow rapidly, and it's imperative that airports be outfitted to meet the needs of customers and local businesses. My home state of Georgia houses the world's busiest airport, Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, and I want to ensure that it remains a globally competitive facility that manages high volumes of traffic with efficiency. The only way we can continue to be a worldwide leader on aviation is by seriously addressing airport infrastructure needs. I'm hopeful that this hearing has shed some light in our plan of action moving forward. If I ask any questions that have already been asked, I'm sorry. If you could please answer. And this one is for Mr. Crowder, Mr. Lopano, and Ms. Mcgraw. For the last 7 years, Congress has maintained level funding, $3.35 billion, for the FAA's Airport Improvement Program. The FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018 keeps it at that same level for another 5 years. How do you anticipate that this maintenance of level funding, as it had been for, I think, 12 years prior, how will that maintenance of this level funding affect ongoing airport infrastructure projects?
Representative Johnson, Larry Crowder from Spokane, thank you for that question. We've talked about that in the context of a couple of things. One is that the flat funding really doesn't stay flat. It gets eaten up by inflation. So that $3.35 billion annual flat funding is really worth about $1.8 billion. So the $5 million that Spokane gets in airport entitlement funds through the AIP every year is really worth about $2.25 million now. And that's just obviously going to decline. As a result of that, we only have two other choices to try to backfill that liability. One is to use PFC funds for projects that would otherwise be funded by AIP. And in my testimony in February, I went into great detail about how about $92 million of the $153 million that we've collected in PFCs in Spokane has actually been used for AIP-eligible projects. And so I think it points out that there is a significant deficit in terms of how that's created by flat AIP. That's also exacerbated by a flat PFC rate. And so one of the things that we think is really important is to talk about how an increase in PFC is really important to funding the projects, because we don't see the ability for Congress to significantly increase AIP.
All right, thank you. That's a good segue to Mr. Christie. Mr. Christie, in your opening remarks, you speak to the potential danger in raising the PFC cap, citing that consumers are already, quote, punishingly taxed, end quote. Consumers most certainly are subject to exorbitant fees on their airline tickets, but how do you balance the burden of lifting the PFC cap for consumers against the weight of the fees that airlines charge consumers, such as the bag and cancellation fees that Spirit and other airlines charge?
Thank you, Congressman. What's most important to the traveling public is the total cost of travel, and on Spirit that is considerably less than you would find on other airlines, even when you include ancillary items like bags and seat assignment. So we've driven a model around asset efficiency that drives lower fares, which stimulates more activity. And the fear is that by increasing a fixed fee amount, in this case the PFC, you will in effect destimulate and artificially burden lower fare paying customers.
Do you think there will be passenger pushback if the PFC cap is lifted?
Well, in effect, it is an increase in the cost of travel, and we manage our supply and demand mix every day, and you can see what happens when the cost of travel goes up, less people travel.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. So I'm not trying to drag this out, but I know there's maybe some other members coming, but I have a few questions. But I do note Mr. Christie does have a 1 o'clock hard stop, no matter how long this goes. You are free to leave at 1. I want to be sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Only because you asked earlier. If anyone didn't ask earlier, I can't be responsible for that. So I will ask a question of Mr. Christie. So you noted your support generally for airport investment. Cincinnati has testified if they don't get a PFC increase, they could end up raising the cost per employment 50%. But if PFC was increased, it would be only 15% for the CPE. So as an airline, how do you all make a choice between the cost of employment cost versus a PFC if you're choosing between a 50% increase for a CPE compared to a 15% increase to a CPE?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think what's missing in that math is the actual PFC itself. So while I'm not sure how the math works out, but an increase in 50% in CPE excludes the existing PFC, and if you instead increase the PFC, you would have to only increase CPE by the amount to finance that PFC-related debt. So I think the funds are fungible. And so what we're talking about is an increase in fees and taxes on the traveling public to finance infrastructure. What my testimony was earlier is that it's our belief that we can more efficiently deliver low fares with more efficient use of assets. And so when the cost of the infrastructure is delivered in the form of rents and landing fees, our model in and of itself makes that more efficient to the customers on Spirit Airlines. And that's what's most important to us.
Can I be clear? Did you call the CPE? Did you say that was a tax on the traveling public? Is that what you meant to say?
No, I'm saying that that's a cost to the traveling public because it's a part of our core cost structure. That's correct.
Yeah, Ms. Mcgraw, do you have something to say on that? Okay, great. So, Ms. Crowder, there was a discussion earlier about bonds. And whether or not you should have more bonds, or they have a 5-year time frame or some other time frame. Can you just remind us how you all repay any bonding?
Right now, that's through the PFC. And that's the way that we have put together our chart that was submitted to the committee to illustrate that the PFC would be committed at the current 450 to a total project cost of $342 million, which effectively would take that PFC out almost 38 years. So if you're 18 years old going through my terminal building, you'll be paying that till you're about 56 years old.
All right. Back to Mr. Christie. Just want to use you while you're here. So a few weeks ago, I visited BWI, and several years ago, BWI used PFC funds to invest in a high-capacity baggage screening system that was created specifically to help Spirit expand. It seems like a great example of lower-cost airlines directly benefiting from PFCs to expand capacity. Is there an inconsistency with generally the airlines not supporting PFC increases when you directly benefit from the uses of those projects? Or how would you help me understand that?
Sure. Thank you for the question. While there are instances, no doubt, where PFC funding did create additional facility space for carriers like ourselves to expand, the PFC in and of itself, because it is a fixed amount and charged on every passenger, is a one-size-fits-all address approach. And we think that there can be more dynamic looks at how you create more capacity at airports. And as I alluded to in an answer earlier, I think that introduces a much broader conversation around competition at airports. With the mergers over the last decade, we now have 4 airlines that control 80% of the capacity in the United States. And I think that's a much more complex issue that a PFC in and of itself does not address.
Maybe worth exploring in the future as well. So I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony. Your comments have been very helpful. Thank you for sharing your comments. Thank you for being patient with the members coming and going as well. We're all very busy and trying to get as much information on this particular issue as possible. I don't see any further questions, but I'm not going to look up to look. So in closing, I'd ask unanimous consent the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing, and unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I'd like to thank our witnesses again for your testimony today, and if no other members have anything to add, which they do not, the committee stands adjourned.